السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ما بعد. So we're going to continue, inshallah, with where we left off yesterday. So we finished talking about the Sahihain. As I mentioned, one of the goals from this is also to know, which beneficial books a person should have in their library. And of course, this depends on what each person's, goal is. But some of these books of Hadith, they have explanations which are, well known and very useful. So from that, Sahih al-Bukhari, the one that we started with, what is the most famous explanation of Sahih al-Bukhari? Fath al-Bari, right? Everybody knows Fath al-Bari. Fath al-Bari by Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, rahimahullah ta'ala, is essential, right? I mean, of course, right, for the talibul ilm, it's essential. The person who just wants to kind of increase their iman, they can do with like Riyadh al-Salihin and a sharh of that. But for a person who wants to study hadith, whether you're thinking, I want to be, a student of hadith, or even just, a student of fiqh, or, just a general student of the deen or a khatib, anyone like that needs Fath al-Bari by Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. And there's a lot of other explanations of Sahih al-Bukhari which are also beneficial. So it's not saying this is the only explanation, but, in the end, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, rahimahullah ta'ala, he basically brought all of the benefit from all the explanations that came before him, and anyone who came after him is referring back to him. So his became kind of like the essential thing, and it's an in-depth study about Sahih al-Bukhari. Really, we could probably spend a class on each one of these books, talk about who is Imam al-Bukhari, everything about his Sahih, all of the explanations. Of course, we don't have time for that, right? So we say, Sahih al-Bukhari with the explanation by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. For Sahih Muslim, again, there's many explanations, but one of the most well-known and most beneficial is the explanation of Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala. Another thing that I forgot to mention yesterday, so the title, Sahih al-Bukhari, this is not what Imam al-Bukhari himself called it. Imam al-Bukhari himself, he called it Al-Jami' al-Musnad, Al-Jami' al-Musnad al-Sahih al-Mukhtasar fi umuri Rasulillahi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa ayyamihi wa sunani. Right? He said that this is the Jami'. So Jami', when a book of hadith is called Jami', it means it has hadiths on every single topic. Right? So this is something that we're going to know the difference when we start talking about Sunan. Right? What does it mean when it's Sunan versus when it's Jami'? So Sunan is plural of Sunnah, meaning this covers the fiqh aspects of hadith, the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. But Jami' it has everything. So it has all of the ahkam, fiqh, but it also has tafsir and the signs of the hour. It has descriptions of Jannah and Jahannam. It has chapters or history, historical chapters. It has chapters about virtues of the Sahaba, etc. So that's why Imam al-Bukhari, he called his book Jami', because it has all of that. And he called it Mukhtasar because he himself, he didn't claim that he has every single Sahih hadith in this. He's saying this is Mukhtasar, this is summarized. I could have added more to it and it still would have been Sahih. So, if a hadith is not in Sahih al-Bukhari, that doesn't mean that we're saying it's not Sahih. Right? Same thing for Sahih Muslim. So Mukhtasar and Musnad, meaning that it's connected with chains to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So then we'll go to the third hadith. وَبِالسَّنَدِ الْمُتَقَدِّمِ إِلَى الْإِمَامِ الْحُجَّةِ أَبِي دَاوُودَ سُلَيْمَانَ بْنِ الْأَشْعَثِ السِّجِسْتَانِي رضي الله عنه لسننه أول حديث منه في ترجمة كتاب الطهارة باب التخلي عند قضاء الحاجة. قال حدثنا عبد الله بن مسلمة بن قعنب القعنبي قال حدثنا عبد العزيز يعني ابن محمد عن محمد يعني ابن عمرو عن أبي سلمة عن المغيرة بن شعبة رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان إذا ذهب المذهب أبعد. So the next book is Sunan Abu Dawud, right? So the author, Abu Dawud as-Sijistani. So Abu Dawud is his kunya. His name, as we see, is Sulaiman ibn al-Ash'ath. And we can see he passed away in the year 275. So roughly about 19 years after Imam al-Bukhari rahimahullah ta'ala. If you have that timeline, you can kind of see where everybody's at. These al-Kutub al-Sitta are all in the 3rd century. So Sunan Abu Dawud, again it's Sunan, plural of Sunnah, meaning that this book is mostly focused on ahkam, the ahadith about fiqh of ibadah, muamalat, and all of the different aspects of fiqh. Not so much about tafsir and things like that as we find in Sahih al-Bukhari. One of the early explanations of this, and it's one of the we could say one of the earliest explanations of a hadith book, is by Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi, called Ma'alim as-Sunan. Ma'alim as-Sunan. Ma'alim as-Sunan. This is by Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi, and Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, he frequently refers to this. He'll say, Al-Khattabi says. Al-Khattabi also had a sharh of Sahih al-Bukhari as well. But his sharh of Sunan Abu Dawud is the one that is well known, and it's available, right? This exists, it's published. So this is also beneficial, and it's short, it's published in like 2 volumes. Some of the scholars, they mentioned that Sunan Abu Dawud, right, if a person masters this in terms of fiqh, this is good. This person is a faqih if they master Sunan Abu Dawud. So some people, they like to focus on that. And this is another point. If a person says, all of these books are beneficial, which one do I buy? Do I have to buy all of them? If you buy one book which kind of covers a wider range of topics and you master that book, then alhamdulillah, right? This is good. Right? So somebody who's focusing on fiqh and wants to be a faqih, then if they were to master Sunan Abu Dawud, alhamdulillah, right? You get Sunan Abu Dawud and the different explanations of that, and that's beneficial. As far as the authenticity of it, yes, there are weak hadiths in it. But Imam Abu Dawud himself, he has this letter. He wrote a risala, a letter to the people of Mecca. So this is called Risalatun ila Ahli Mecca. The risala to the people of Mecca by Abu Dawud, where he talks about his sunan. He says, this is what I put in it. And he basically says in it that anything that is in this book, if it has severe weakness, I will point it out. Right? If it has severe weakness, if I point it out, and if I don't say anything, then it is salih. Salih doesn't necessarily mean he's saying it's sahih, but he's saying it's salih, it's good to narrate. Meaning, the Imams of Hadith, including Imam Ahmad, who was a teacher of Abu Dawud, they were more strict when it came to the isnad in hadiths of ahkam, hadith dealing with halal and haram, or affirming aqidah and things like that. But if the hadith was dealing with fada'ilul a'mal, they would be less strict, meaning they would narrate a hadith which, maybe there's a slight weakness in it, right? Remember we talked about yesterday, some people, they would say, la yuktabu hadithu. His hadith shouldn't even be written down, meaning that person, it doesn't matter what he's narrating, we don't narrate from him. But some people, they have a bad memory. We might narrate the hadith from that person if it's just something about encouragement of doing good deeds. But if it's a hadith about this is halal, this is haram, this is wajib, or this is a matter of aqidah, then they're much more strict about whose hadiths they include in their book. So same thing, Abu Dawud, he has also that standard as well. So now somebody might look at Sunan Abu Dawud and they find a hadith where Imam Abu Dawud doesn't say anything after it. He doesn't say this hadith is weak, or this, so-and-so is a weak narrator. So does that automatically mean that Abu Dawud is saying that this is a strong hadith? There's lots of factors that we have to understand. One is Abu Dawud, Sunan Abu Dawud, right? There's more than one manuscript of it. More than one manuscript. So before we can say Abu Dawud didn't say anything, we have to make sure that we've looked in all of the manuscripts. Because maybe one person was writing and didn't write Abu Dawud's comments after it, but another person did. So first thing, we have to make sure we look in all the manuscripts. Then another factor is, sometimes Abu Dawud will mention in one hadith, he'll say, this hadith, so-and-so narrator in this hadith is weak. And he's pointing out to you that this is a weak hadith because of that narrator. And then he might repeat that hadith later in the book with the same narrator and he doesn't say anything. That doesn't mean he's saying it's acceptable this time, but that means if you've been memorizing the book up till now, you would know, right? You know this is weak because I pointed out earlier that this narrator is weak. So those things need to be kept in mind. But after that, right, if Abu Dawood doesn't say anything and we have all of those factors, then we could say Abu Dawood, he said that this hadith at least doesn't contain any severe weaknesses. The next one, وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحجة أبي عيسى محمد بن عيسى بن ثورة الترمذي رضي الله تعالى عنه لقراءة سننه المسمى بالجامع أوله أبواب الطهارة عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم باب ما جاء لا تقبل صلاة بغير طهور. قال حدثنا قتيبة بن سعيد قال حدثنا أبو عوانة عن سماك بن حرب وحدثنا هناد قال حدثنا وكيع عن إسرائيل عن سماك عن مصعب بن سعد عن ابن عمر رضي الله عنهما عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال لا تقبل صلاة بغير طهور ولا صدقة من غلول. The next one is the book of Imam at-Tirmidhi. And you see here, Muhammad Sa'id Sunbul, rahimahullah ta'ala, he said in his Sunan. And this is what yesterday when I had asked the question about the 6 books of hadith, and the person who answered it said Sunan at-Tirmidhi. That's what we see it, like you buy the book and it says on the cover Sunan at-Tirmidhi. The question is that correct? Well, here we see right away that he says that al-musammatu bil-jami. It's called al-jami. So remember, there's a difference between a sunan and a jami. Sunan meaning it is more about dealing with ahkam. Jami', like Sahih al-Bukhari, meaning it covers ahkam and it covers, signs of the Day of Judgment. It covers description of the hereafter, tafsir. All of that is in the book of Imam at-Tirmidhi. So the book of Imam at-Tirmidhi is more correctly to be called al-Jami', Jami' at-Tirmidhi. Usually, people say the Ashabu Sunan, right? The people of the Sunan narrate the hadith. They're talking about at-Tirmidhi as well. But if we want to describe Imam at-Tirmidhi's book as it is, we would say it's Jami'. Imam at-Tirmidhi's book, rahimahullah ta'ala, has a lot of benefits that aren't found in any of the other books of hadith. And that's that Imam at-Tirmidhi himself grades every hadith at the end. Right? So he doesn't say a general thing like Abu Dawood said, if I say something it's no good, but if otherwise it's salih, it's good. But Imam at-Tirmidhi, after every hadith, he'll grade it. That's one benefit. Number 2, Imam at-Tirmidhi, and this is not unique to Imam at-Tirmidhi, we'll see others do this as well, but Imam at-Tirmidhi will point out any hidden defects in the hadith, right? Which is another one of our things that we're looking for when we're calling the hadith sahih. So he'll show any type of ikhtilaf, differing that occurred, and then he'll mention which one is better. And then one of the most unique things that he does is he will talk about what the fuqaha say about this hadith. So for example, he'll narrate a hadith and he'll say, Al-amalu ala hadha al-hadith inda fulan wa fulan. Right? The action, this hadith is acted upon according to so-and-so, so-and-so, Imam Shafi, Imam Ahmad, and he'll mention which fuqaha act upon this hadith. And then usually he'll bring, if there is ikhtilaf in the mas'ala, right, meaning some scholars act upon this hadith and others say, no, we don't act upon that hadith, then he'll bring the next opinion, right, the next hadith, and he'll say, this hadith is acted upon by so-and-so and so-and-so. And then oftentimes he'll mention, if one is weak or one is authentic. So Imam at-Tirmidhi's book is one of the most beneficial for studying and getting that broad picture, joining between the science of hadith as well as the fiqh of the hadith. And again, there's been a lot of explanations written by the scholars of Jami' at-Tirmidhi. One of the best ones is one of the modern ones, which I referred to, which is Tuhfatul Ahwathi by Shaykh Abdul Rahman al-Mubarak Furi, who passed away about 100 years ago, rahimahullah ta'ala. And he has an introduction in this book, in his book Tuhfatul Ahwathi. He has an introduction, several hundred pages, which is, goes over all of the stuff we talked about yesterday. The history of compilation of hadith, and talks about every type of book of hadith, what do they all mean, who are the authors, and many other things. And he has a lot of other beneficial things. He's from India, so he has a section about how the knowledge of hadith basically came to India and how it's stronger in India than it is in other places. So he has a lot of beneficial things. So the book itself is very beneficial, and the introduction is beneficial as well. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحافظ الناقد أبي عبد الرحمن أحمد بن شعيب بن علي النسائي رضي الله عنه بقراءة سننه المسماة بالمجتبى أوله كتاب الطهارة تأويل قوله تعالى إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق. قال أخبرنا قتيبة بن سعيد قال حدثنا سفيان عن الزهري عن أبي سلمة عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال إذا استيقظ أحدكم من نومه فلا يغمس يده في وضوئه حتى يغسلها ثلاثة فإن أحدكم لا يدري أين باتت يده. The next one is Sunan al-Nasa'i. Al-Nasa'i, we see he passed away in the year 303, right? So a little bit later in terms of the year he passed away. Imam al-Nasa'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, it's been said, and this is actually, could be true, that he, in terms of ilmul hadith and ilmul rijal, that he's above Imam Muslim. That Imam al-Nasa'i is an imam, not just in the fact that he compiled the hadith, but he's also an imam when it comes to al-jarh wa ta'dil. So in the books where they're talking about biographies of narrators, this one narrator is authentic, this narrator is weak, frequently, one of the imams that will be quoted is Imam al-Nasa'i. Imam al-Nasa'i said this is a weak narrator. Imam al-Nasa'i said this is a strong narrator. Likewise, when it comes to defects in hadith, Imam al-Nasa'i is one of the experts in this. And this, as you see, he says the book which is called Al-Mujtaba. Al-Mujtaba basically means, it's kind of like the, chosen like this small amount from it. Basically what this is referring to is Imam al-Nasa'i has another book called As-Sunan al-Kubra. As-Sunan al-Kubra, the major book of Sunan, is volumes and volumes. And this is a book, we know Imam al-Nasa'i wrote it, and in that book there's other things which have been published independently, like Amal al-Yawmi wal-Layla, right? About a book of Adhkar, and all of that is found in As-Sunan al-Kubra. Another thing in As-Sunan al-Kubra is he will gather all of the paths of the hadith to show if there's any defects in the hadith, and show which one is correct, where's there a mistake, etc. So As-Sunan al-Sughra, or also called Al-Mujtaba, is basically, what we could say like the summarized volume, the volume where, or the version of it which, doesn't have every single path of the hadith, but just, the correct one, or just a few of them, or just something to kind of, show you the basis of the hadith. But a person who really wants to, study Sunan al-Nasa'i in depth, they would get Al-Kubra. Now, there's been explanations written. One of the famous ones was written by a scholar who recently passed away, rahmatullahi alayh, Muhammad ibn Adam al-Ethiopi, rahmatullahi alayh, has like a 40-volume sharh of this Sunan al-Nasa'i. So, this is also an extensive work. He actually has explanations of all of al-Kutub al-Sitta, but his explanation of Sunan al-Nasa'i is very extensive. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحجة أبي عبد الله محمد بن يزيد بن ماجة القزويني في أول سننه باب اتباع سنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال حدثنا أبو بكر بن أبي شيبة قال حدثنا شريك عن الأعمش عن أبي صالح عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما أمرتكم به فخذوه وما نهيتكم عنه فانتهوا. So the sixth one, and this, remember we asked about the six, someone mentioned 5, they forgot Ibn Majah, one of the sisters remembered Ibn Majah. So we talked about what are al-Kutub al-Sitta, right? What makes them al-Kutub al-Sitta? So there was a time, right, because when Ibn Majah finished writing it, they didn't say, oh, that's the 6th book, now we have al-Kutub al-Sitta, right? When did they start being called that? There was a time where the scholars, they used to say al-Kutub al-Khamsa, the 5 books of hadith, and they didn't have Ibn Majah. It was just the 5 that we mentioned before. Sunan Ibn Majah had been written at this time, but they kind of considered these 5 that we have up till now, these are like the essential. These are the 5 where pretty much any authentic hadith would be found in these 5. Now, yes, they're not saying that there's no authentic hadith outside of these 5, but for the most part, if you had these 5 books of hadith and you memorized the hadiths in these 5 books of hadith, you have what you need, right? So these are, and these also have a very high standard, right? So then some started saying al-Kutub al-Sitta. But they differed, what is that sixth one, when they started calling al-Kutub al-Sitta. Some would say al-Kutub al-Sitta, and they would mention the Muwatta of Imam Malik, which we're going to come to. And the Muwatta of Imam Malik, we could say, is more authentic than Sunan ibn Majah in terms of standard. But the Muwatta of Imam Malik is not meant to be a full collection of hadith. This is basically the fiqh of Imam Malik, and he's just mentioning the ahadith as evidence for his madhab. This is the main purpose of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. So some of them said, well, in that case, it's not really, it doesn't really belong with these. Not there in authenticity, but in subject matter, it's not the same. So others said, no, it would be more befitting to add Sunan ad-Darimi, which we're also going to see in a little bit. And many still say, yes, Sunan ad-Darimi is more authentic, it's better than Sunan ibn Majah. But one of the scholars, Ibn Tahir al-Maqdisi, rahimahullah ta'ala, he wrote a book called Shurut al-A'imma as-Sitta, the conditions of the 6 Imams. And the 6 Imams, he included the 6th as being Ibn Majah. So because his book was good and well known and well accepted, it kind of went, okay, these are the 6. Then came Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi, who's the author of what book? Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi? Umdatul Ahkam. So the author of Umdatul Ahkam, he wrote this book, Al-Kamal fi Asma'ir Rijal, where he collected the biographies of all of the narrators in the 6 books of hadith, and he made Ibn Majah as the 6th of those. Now, because his book now became kind of the encyclopedia if you want to know who these narrators are, and he called Ibn Majah the 6th, then it just stuck, right? That's it, that's the 6th. So now anyone who talks about Al-Kutub al-Sitta is referring to these 6 books of hadith. Some of the scholars, they've said most of the hadiths that Ibn Majah has that aren't found in the other books. So we're not saying the majority of the hadiths in Ibn Majah are not sahih, right? But you could say the majority of them are found in those other 5 books. We're concerned about the ones that are found in Ibn Majah that aren't found in any of those other 5 books. Are the majority of those sahih, or are the majority of those da'if? If we say the majority of those are da'if, it again doesn't mean that the majority of the hadiths in his book as a whole are da'if, but the majority of the ones that he uniquely narrates from the other 5, if those are da'if, then we would say there's not that much benefit of calling his book the 6th of the 6, right? And some of them have said that, but there are definitely authentic hadiths that are found in Sunan ibn Majah that aren't found in any of the other 5. So not that there's no benefit for a person to study Sunan ibn Majah, and not only that, sometimes just the layout of the book might be beneficial. Ibn Majah, rahimahullah ta'ala, he has what some people call the muqaddimah, the introduction of Sunan ibn Majah, but it's actually just several hundred hadiths just about following the Sunnah. So he has a very beneficial introduction, what we could call it an introduction about following the Sunnah and the status of the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and being careful when narrating hadith, and lots of benefit in that. So it's definitely a beneficial book, but some of the scholars have said Sunan ad-Darimi would be more befitting. So his book is called Al-Kamal fi Asma'ir Rijal. After him, Al-Hafidh al-Mizzi came and basically found anything that Abdul Ghani was missing and added it. Maybe he missed a biography, he added that. He also did a lot of work on mentioning who all the students and all of the teachers were from every one of the sheikhs, and did a lot of other work, and he called that Tahdhib al-Kamal. So now Tahdhib al-Kamal, this is the one you need. If you are a student of hadith, you need this book. It might be expensive, but you need it, right? You can't study hadith and study isnad without this book, Tahdhib al-Kamal, by Al-Hafidh al-Mizzi. Al-Kamal by Abdul Ghani al-Maqdisi, rahmatullahi alayh, right? He's an imam and an alim who started it. And sometimes you might say this person who started it, they have more knowledge, right? And they did far more work, but somebody comes and just, fixes it later, that one that is fixed is more beneficial. It doesn't mean that scholars, they were discounting the work of the person who started it, but Al-Hafidh al-Mizzi, rahmatullahi alayhi, his book Tahdibu al-Kamal is kind of the standard now. Yeah. I mean, Imam al-Nasa'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, again, he's much stricter in his standard, right? So his book is very, some of them say that his book should be mentioned right after Bukhari and Muslim, right, in terms of his standard. Also, you see even though, yes, there is this 30-year difference between the year that they died, but there's only 6 years between the years that they were born. So in terms of their age, and in terms of their tabaqa and who their shuyukh are, there's not really any difference. And also, some of these imams, as we're going to see, a lot of these imams, they started seeking knowledge when they were young. Some of them, they started seeking knowledge when they're like 8 years old. So they have, shuyukh, they're sitting in the gathering with, 20-year-olds. They have the same shuyukh as people who are like 20 years older than them. So, in terms of isnad, they're kind of at the same level. باب وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحجة أبي عبد الله محمد بن عبد الرحمن الدارمي السمرقندي لكتابه المسند الذي أوله باب ما كان عليه الناس من قبل مبعث النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من الجهل والضلالة. قال أخبرنا محمد بن يوسف عن سفيان عن الأعمش عن أبي وائل عن عبد الله رضي الله عنه قال رجل يا رسول الله أيؤاخذ الرجل بما عمل في الجاهلية؟ قال من أحسن في الإسلام لم يؤاخذ بما كان عمل في الجاهلية ومن أساء في الإسلام أخذ بالأول والآخر. The next one is Sunan al-Darimi, or also called al-Musnad, Musnad al-Darimi. Now remember, we talked yesterday about al-Musnad. What does it mean when a book is called al-Musnad? Like Musnad Imam Ahmad. Okay, when we talked about Mustalah al-Hadith, we said there was a definition of Musnad is the hadiths are connected. It's connected and it's marfu'. But yes, good. This is it. Good job. It's grouped, organized by the Sahabi who narrated the hadith. Right? So this is it. But this is not how Imam al-Darimi's book is. His book is organized by chapter, like the other books of Sunan. So some say it should be Sunan al-Darimi, and usually you see it published as Sunan al-Darimi. Some say, well, in that case, what it means by Musnad, whenever anyone calls it Musnad al-Darimi, is that the hadiths are Musnad in the definition that Brother Muhammad gave, right? Meaning they're connected to the Prophet ﷺ. And some say, actually, and this is what As-Suyuti says in his book Tadrib al-Rawi, most likely he had another book, a Musnad, that was grouped by Sahabi that is not with us, and the Sunan is what is with us. And since both of these were famously attributed to him, they kind of, mixed between the two. But Allahu Alam, and this is, these are the type of things that if, as the question that was asked yesterday, if a person wanted to do research, how could you find that out? How could you find out, was there actually another book that is missing? You could go through all of the old books, anyone who quoted the books of Ad-Darimi, and find out who said Musnad, who said Sunan. The ones who said Musnad and called it the Musnad of Ad-Darimi, the hadith that they're mentioning, is it found in the Sunan? If it's found in the Sunan that is with us, then that means it's one and the same, right? But if there's hadiths that are mentioned that aren't found in the Sunan, then we could say, yeah, maybe there is a book called Al-Musnad which is missing. That's obviously a scholarly research that would require a lot of investigation. نعم. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحجة القدوة في كل شأن مالك بن أنس لموطأ الذي اتفق على تصحيحه أهل كل زمان أول باب وقوت الصلاة برواية يحيى عن مالك بن أنس عن ابن شهاب رضي الله رحمه الله تعالى أن عمر بن عبد العزيز أخر الصلاة يوما فدخل عليه عروة بن الزبير فأخبره أن المغيرة بن شعبة أخر الصلاة يوما وهو بالكوفة فدخل عليه أبو مسعود الأنصاري رضي الله عنه فقال ما هذا يا مغيرة أليس قد علمت أن جبريل نزل فصلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ثم 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 قال بهذا أمرت. قال عمر بن عبد العزيز اعلم ما تحدث به يا عروة، أو أن جبريل هو الذي أقام للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وقت الصلاة. قال عروة كذلك كان بشير بن أبي مسعود الأنصاري يحدث عن أبيه. قال عروة ولقد حدثتني عائشة زوج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يصلي العصر والشمس في حجرتها قبل أن تظهر. So the next book is the Muwatta of Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala. So Imam Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, he has his book, as I mentioned, Al-Muwatta, which is primarily the fiqh of Imam Malik, but it's a book of hadith. Because the fuqaha in the past, they didn't just talk from their opinion with no evidence. Their fiqh was the hadith, right? So his book of fiqh is mentioning a hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he would also mention fatawa from the Sahaba and from the Tabi'een, and then he would also kind of give his own fiqh. He would say, we act upon this hadith and mention some masail or branches of issues that could be extracted from that hadith. So the Muwatta of Imam Malik has several narrators, right? There's several students that narrated the Muwatta of Imam Malik. So usually now, if you were to, Google Muwatta of Imam Malik and you buy a copy online and it comes to your house and it just says the Muwatta of Imam Malik, the standard is this is the narration of Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi. And that's why he says here, the narration of Yahya. But there's many others, and some people have, published a book with, 8 or 9 different narrations of the Muwatta, all found in one book. It might be difference in order because it's not that Imam Malik narrated to all these people all at once. So maybe Imam Malik narrates to some students, and then he himself, like we see first edition, second edition, he might think, okay, now I'm going to flip this chapter and that chapter around. Or I'm going to put this chapter at the end. So certain things like that might be, found from one to the other, but for the most part, they're very similar, except for one narration, which we're going to see in a second. But one of the most famous or the most beneficial books, explanations of the Muwatta of Imam Malik is the book At-Tamheed by Ibn Abdul Barr. So Ibn Abdul Barr was as a muhaddith and a faqih. And he wrote this book At-Tamheed where he talks about all of the isnad and all of the fiqh found in the book of Imam Malik, the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Some of the people, they say anyone who's a faqih, anyone who's a mufti has to have this book At-Tamheed by Ibn Abdul Barr. It's essential. So, even if you're not Maliki, right? I mean, it's still a source book, right? All of the other books of hadith, and by the way, this is another, kind of side note, when someone says, oh, Sahih al-Bukhari, Imam al-Bukhari is, okay, Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, we talked, Imam Malik, he passed away in the year 179, right? So, how can we see if Imam al-Bukhari himself just made up these hadiths, or if they were just made up in the time of Imam al-Bukhari? Well, let's take every hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari where Imam Malik is in the isnad, and then compare that to the Muwatta of Imam Malik. And we'll see they're the same. It's the same hadiths. This is the hadith of Imam Malik, right? So, and this is just Imam Malik. Same thing, Ma'mar ibn Rashid. Anytime we see an isnad with Ma'mar has also a book of hadith, which is published. And you can compare that to all of the books of hadith with Ma'mar and see it's the same. Abdul Razak has a Musannaf. You compare to Abdul Razak, right? So on and so forth. Anyway, the Muwatta of Imam Malik, rahimahullah ta'ala, another thing that would be, a lot of people, Imam al-Shafi'i included, Imam al-Shafi'i memorized the Muwatta of Imam Malik and, was known to say this is one of the most beneficial books. So someone who might say, I want to memorize a book of hadith with isnad, the Muwatta might be actually a good choice. Because one, it's a little bit smaller, or quite smaller than the other books. And since Imam Malik is, about 100 years before, that means we're kind of like, we have two less names in each isnad. A lot of times, Imam Malik in his Muwatta, he has something that none of the other 6 books of hadith have, which is hadith thuna'iyat. Thuna'iyat means there's only two names between him and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Imam Malik has an Nafi' and Ibn Umar. For one example, he has many, but there's one person and then the Sahabi and then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Of course, those types of isnads would be easy to memorize too. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحجة الهمامي صاحب أبي حنيفة محمد بن الحسن لموطأ عن الإمام مالك وغيره بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. باب وقوت الصلاة. قال محمد بن الحسن أخبرنا مالك بن أنس عن يزيد بن زياد مولى بني هاشم عن عبد الله بن رافع مولى أم سلمة رضي الله عنها زوج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أنه سأله عن وقت الصلاة فقال أبو هريرة أنا أخبرك صل الظهر إذا كان ظلك مثلك والعصر إذا كان ظلك مثليك والمغرب إذا غربت الشمس والعشاء وما بينك وبين ثلث الليل فإن نمت إلى نصف الليل فلا نامت عينك وصل الصبح بغلس. The next one is the Muwatta, and this is often referred to, sometimes you'll see it as the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad. Sometimes it's published as this, and a lot of people maybe from the Indian subcontinent have heard it like this, the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad. Because this is the Muwatta of Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, but in actuality it's the Muwatta of Imam Malik, and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani is the narrator, just like Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi was the narrator. But the difference is, Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani is a great Imam of the Hanafi madhab. He's one of the famous students of Abu Hanifa. Usually when we're talking about Abu Hanifa, we talk about two of his main students, Abu Yusuf al-Qadi and Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani. So Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, right? Remember, the Muwatta of Imam Malik is basically a Maliki book of fiqh, right? Yes, it's a book of hadith, but the purpose is a Maliki book of fiqh. And Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani is Hanafi. So he narrates these hadiths from Imam Malik, but his goal now is to prove his madhab. So he doesn't have all of the hadiths that Imam Malik narrates. That's the first part, right? There's about 400 hadiths. And he has some ahadith that are not narrated from Imam Malik. He has some from his Imam, Abu Hanifa, right? So he has some hadiths he narrates from Abu Hanifa and from others, right? Because also he now, Imam Malik is mostly, as we learned yesterday, right, from Medina. Most of his shuyukh are from Medina. There are exceptions, but mostly from Medina. So now Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani can, bring some ahadith from Kufa and, different asanid. So anyway, this is why you often hear it called the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad, because it's very different from the others, right? Where the others, they're just trying to preserve the work of Imam Malik, but Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, he learned the hadith from Malik, but he's making it into his own Muwatta to, as proof for the Hanafi madhab. And this also has, beneficial explanations. One of the ones from a fairly modern scholar, not, too modern, fairly modern scholar, is from Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, التعليق الممجد على موطأ الإمام محمد. وبالسند المتصل إلى أبي حنيفة الإمام الأعظم والحبر المقدم لمسانيده 15 المتعددة بحسب جامعيها. So before I read all of this, so the next one, he's saying the Musnad of Imam Abu Hanifa. Now, Abu Hanifa himself, rahimahullah ta'ala, didn't compile a book and say, this is my Musnad. Imam Abu Hanifa didn't do this. We don't say Imam Abu Hanifa didn't know hadith and didn't have hadith. This claim is not true, but also, to be fairness, we also can't exaggerate and say he was the same as Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, and Imam Ahmed when it comes to hadith. Not about fiqh, not about istinbat from the masail, but when it comes to hadith, it's not the same. Look at Al-Kutub al-Sitta. You can't find a single chapter without hadith going from Imam Malik. Look at the Musnad of Imam Ahmed. Right? It's not the same. But, that being said, Imam Abu Hanifa, without a doubt, is one of the great ai*imma of this deen. And he does have hadith and he does narrate a hadith, but he didn't compile it the way that those other scholars compiled it. So some people later, and he mentions 15 different scholars who came later and basically took on this task. Some of them were students of Abu Hanifa or a couple generations after Abu Hanifa. Some of them didn't even follow the Hanafi madhab. Some of them, as we're going to learn, actually they kind of didn't like Abu Hanifa. But they still did this as, this scholarly effort to find all of the hadiths that are narrated by Abu Hanifa and to compile them. And then later somebody comes and takes all 15 of those different ones and puts it in one book. And this is what he mentions here. So he mentions all 15 of these. He says, فَمُسْنَدٌ رَوَاهُ عَنْهُ عَبْدُ اللَّهِ الْأُسْتَاذ وآخر رواه عنه طلحة بن محمد بن جعفر الشاهد العدل وثالث بجمع محمد بن المظفر ورابع these are Shafi'i scholars right now ورابع بجمع أبي نعيم الأصبهاني أو الأصفهاني. This is the author of حلية الأولياء, and we're going to see a book of his coming up. ورابع بجمع وخامس بجمع محمد بن عبد الباقي بن محمد الأنصاري وسادس بجمع عبد الله بن عدي الجرجاني. عبد الله بن عدي is a famous scholar of Hadith and Al-Jarh wa Ta'dil. He has a book called Al-Kamil fi Du'afa al-Rijal. Al-Kamil libni Adi. Right? So his book Al-Kamil is all of the narrators who are weak narrators or narrators who have been criticized, and sometimes they're not weak, they were falsely criticized, and he'll point out, why that criticism is false. So his book is a collection of these weak narrators. So he also compiled the books of the hadiths of Abu Hanifa. In his book, Al-Kamil, right, where he talks about, these weak narrators, one of the narrators he talks about is Abu Hanifa. So he considers him a weak narrator and he doesn't defend him. He basically says quite a bit about Abu Hanifa, rahmatullah, being a weak narrator, right? Whether we agree or not, aside, but, he is one of the ones who compiled the Musnad of Imam أبو حنيفة رحمه الله تعالى. وسابع بجمع الحسن بن زياد اللؤلؤي وثامن بجمع عمر بن الحسن الأشناني وتاسع بجمع أبي بكر الكلاعي وعاشر بجمع الحسين بن محمد بن خسرو البلخي وحادي عشر بجمع أبي يوسف يسمى نسخة أبي يوسف the student of Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala rahimahumullah ta'ala والثاني عشر وثالث عشر بجمع الإمام محمد بن الحسن الشيباني أحدهما معظمه عن التابعين فلهذا سمي الآثار. And he says the 13th and the 14th, or the 12th and the 13th, are compiled by Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, the one we just spoke about earlier. And so he says one of them, it's called al-Athar. And the reason for that is most of them are athar from the tabi'een, right? Meaning they're not hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, but it's Abu Hanifa talking about what the tabi'een said, the tabi'een of Kufa, right? So, وَرَابِعَ عَشَرَ بِجَمْعِ ابْنِهِ حَمَّادٍ عَنْهُ أي عن والده أبي حنيفة. So also Hammad ibn Abi Hanifa, the son of Abu Hanifa, also compiled a musnad of the hadiths of his father. وَخَامِسَ عَشَرَ بِجَمْعِ أبي القاسم السعدي وجميعها جمعها في كتاب واحد محمد بن محمود العربي محتدا الخوارزمي مولدا. So al-Khawarazmi, right? If you want to find this with all 15 of these compiled, you would say Musnad of Abu Hanifa, and then just write al-Khawarazmi, and you'll find that collection of all 15 of those together. مرتبا لها على ترتيب أبواب الفقه من باب الطهارة إلى باب المواريث، لكنه قدم على هذه بابا فيما يتعلق بالإيمان، فصار هذا الباب هو أول المسانيد، لكنه جعل له كالمقدمة بابين. الأول ما ذكر في شيء. Now the reason why someone would say, why is he going on so long about the Musnad of Abu Hanifa to even get to the hadith? Because it's a little bit more complicated when Abu Hanifa himself didn't compile a Musnad, right? So now he's saying all of these 15 people compiled the Musnad of Abu Hanifa. Well, which one are we going to pick? Okay, let me tell you all 15. Here's someone who compiled it. And then, did he just start with the first hadith? No, he had an introduction and all of this. So he's telling all of this just to say this is why the first hadith that I'm mentioning as the Musnad of Abu Hanifa. والثاني في ذكر أسانيد هذا الجامع وطرقه الموصلة له إلى جامعيها، وقد استغرق نحو عشر الكتاب، فصار الجامع للمسانيد هو 19 الكتاب. أولها الباب الثالث فيما يتعلق بالإيمان وهو يشتمل على 4 فصول. الفصل الأول في التحريض على الحسنات والتحذير على السيئات. الثاني في الإيمان والتصديق بالقضاء والقدر والشفاعة وغيرها. الثالث في الزهد في الدنيا والتأسي بأخلاق النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وأصحابه. الرابع في الفضائل. الفصل الأول قال أبو حنيفة رحمه الله تعالى عن عبد الله بن أنيس رضي الله عنه صاحب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه قال: حبك للشيء يعمي ويصم. ثم أورده في طرق أخرى مرفوعا إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. So this is the hadith, right? Just this part here is the first hadith, but all of that just explaining what he's referring to when he says the first hadith. وبالسند المتقدم. نعم. Okay, I know what you're going to ask. Yeah. So this mas'ala gets mentioned. Is Abu Hanifa a tabi'i, or is he from atba'u tabi'in? This is what you were going to ask, right? Yeah. Yeah. So again, to being fair, right? Many of people who follow the Hanafi madhab, they claim that Abu Hanifa is a tabi'i, and they'll use this as a proof because it kind of seems more like it makes him above the other imams if we say he's a tabi'i and everybody else from atba'u tabi'in. So that, but do we have proof that he's a tabi'i in the sense that he heard from a sahabi? Not that his life overlapped, because again, we're not talking about someone whose life overlapped with a sahabi, but we're talking about somebody who met the sahaba. So Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala himself, he was born in the year 80 Hijr. We saw Anas ibn Malik rahimahullah ta'ala passed away in the year 93. Of course, that's 13 years of life that overlap, right? The last Sahabi who passed away is Abu Tufail, Wathilatu ibn al-Asqa', who passed away in the year 110 Hijr. So there's plenty of overlap. But Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala was in Kufa. He wasn't in Medina. Yes, there are companions who went to Kufa. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud passed away in the year 32, long before the birth of Abu Hanifa, right? Ali ibn Abi Talib passed away before that, right? So many of these companions passed away long before the birth of Abu Hanifa. Therefore, Al-Hafidh ibn Hajjar rahimahullah ta'ala, in his book Taqrib al-Tahdhib, when he mentions the tabaqat of the narrators, meaning what generation are they from, he calls Abu Hanifa from As-Sadis. As-Sadis means that this is a person who did not meet any companion, but they're basically, from their life might have overlapped, but they didn't meet any companions. So Allahu A'lam, right? And some of the people talk more in depth about this, but they say that he didn't meet Abdullah ibn Unais or any other companion, Allahu A'lam. And as you see, the word an, we would just say that's mursalun khafi, that it's not connected. Allah knows best. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الجليل المطلبي النبيل محمد بن إدريس الشافعي رضي الله عنه بمسنده من رواية الربيع بن سليمان المرادي الرازي أوله بجمع أبي العباس محمد بن يعقوب الأصم. كتاب الطهارة. قال أخبرنا مالك بن أنس عن صفوان بن سليم عن سعيد بن سلمة رجل من آل بن الأزرق أن المغيرة بن أبي بردة وهو من بني عبد الدار أخبره أنه سمع أبا هريرة رضي الله عنه يقول: سأل رجل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال: يا رسول الله، إنا نركب البحر ونحمل معنا القليل من الماء، فإن توضأنا به عطشنا، أفنتوضأ بماء البحر؟ فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم: هو الطهور ماؤه الحل ميتته. So the next one is the Musnad of Imam al-Shafi'i, which, we say similar to the Musnad of Abu Hanifa, that Imam al-Shafi'i didn't, compile this as, this is my Musnad. But Imam al-Shafi'i, he did have books, Al-Risala and other books that he wrote and, narrated as this is his book with his asanid. But, some of his students, they compiled all of his hadiths into this Musnad. And that student being one of his most famous and most well-known students, Al-Rabi' ibn Sulaiman al-Muradi. And then from Al-Rabi', Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Asam, who's also a great scholar. And actually, it's his manuscript that is found for several of these. Yes, but then he mentioned another here. وبالسند المتقدم إليه رضي الله عنه في سننه برواية إسماعيل بن يحيى المزني. قال حدثني الشافعي قال حدثنا سفيان عن الزهري قال سمعت أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه يقول قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا حضر العشاء وأقيمت الصلاة فابدأوا بالعشاء. So then same thing for the Sunan of Imam al-Shafi. We see the narrator here is Ismail ibn Yahya al-Muzani. Ismail ibn Yahya al-Muzani, and again one of the very famous students of Imam al-Shafi'i, and he also has a book of Aqidah which is very beneficial, Sharh al-Sunnah by al-Muzani. وبالسند المتقدم إلى Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala, also another one of his books with books of hadith which is published and well known and very useful is Al-Umm, which it's kind of, I don't know why the author preferred this over that. Maybe in his time it wasn't as, or where he was he didn't have access to it. Allahu a'lam. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام أحمد بن حنبل الورع الزاهد الممجد لمسنده في رواية ولده عبد الله عنه من مسند أبي بكر الصديق عبد الله الملقب بعتيق رضي الله تعالى عنه قال عبد الله بن أحمد بن محمد بن حنبل حدثني أبي أحمد بن محمد بن حنبل بن هلال بن أسد من كتابه قال حدثنا عبد الله بن نمير قال حدثنا إسماعيل يعني ابن أبي خالد عن قيس قال قام أبو بكر رضي الله تعالى عنه فحمد الله وأثنى عليه ثم قال يا أيها الناس إنكم تقرؤون هذه الآية يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم وإن سمعنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول إن الناس إذا رأوا المنكر فلم يغيروه أوشك أن يعمهم الله بعقابه. The next one is the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, and we see Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala passed away before all of the authors of Al-Kutub Sitta. In fact, he's one of the Mashayikh of Abu Dawood. So in Sunan Abu Dawood, you'll find that he narrates from Imam Ahmad. So the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, as I mentioned yesterday, this is about 28,000 hadiths. And this is the largest book we have, collection of marfu hadiths. We have another book of hadith, which we're going to see in a bit, which is larger than it, but it's not all marfu. It's several of these narrations are narrations of the Sahaba and Tabi'een. But when it comes to marfu hadiths, it's Imam Ahmad, his Musnad is the largest, and very close to that, we would say, is Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir by Imam al-Tabarani, which for some reason the author did not put here. He puts a different book of al-Tabarani in here. But Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir by al-Tabarani is very similar to the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. But Imam Ahmad actually has more in his Musnad than Imam al-Tabarani. But Imam al-Tabarani has some things in his Mu'jam that are not in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. As far as the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, it's very beneficial, even though that's a huge book. But some of the scholars, they memorized the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And someone asked one of these scholars, they said, have you memorized Al-Kutub Sitta? And he said, yeah. And he said, yes, I've memorized Al-Kutub Sitta. And he said, asked him, and he says, I've memorized the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. So therefore, I've memorized everything that's in Al-Kutub Sitta. Basically meaning this book is, if you have the capability to memorize 28,000 hadiths, and you memorize the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, you have everything you need. Again, you might say there's a small number of outliers, but for the most part, everything is there, right? And this was, but Imam Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala, he still has, standard. That's why, it's been said that there's no fabricated hadiths in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. In 28,000 hadiths, all of these, yes, some might be da'if, weak, but there's nothing that this is a lie, right? There's no. And some of them, some people like Ibn al-Jawzi, who, maybe kind of mentioned that there was, but other people came and, refuted that and showed that no, there's no fabricated hadiths in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And of course, there's no sharh. Yes, people have done ta'liq on it, small comment on each hadith, but, a sharh on 28,000 hadiths this would be more than a lifetime, right? وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الهمامي محمد بن الحسن الشيباني لكتابه المسمى بالآثار. he already mentioned and hinted to al-athar by Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, but he mentions this here anyway. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Babul wudu'i an Muhammad ibn al-Hasani qala akhbarana Abu Hanifata an Hammad an Ibrahim an al-Aswad ibn Yazid an Umar ibn al-Khattabi radiyallahu anhu أنه توضأ فغسل يديه مثنى وتمضمض مثنى واستنشق مثنى وغسل وجهه مثنى وغسل ذراعيه مثنى مقبلا ومدبرا ومسح رأسه مثنى وغسل رجليه مثنى. Again, remember what he mentioned is this book Athar, most of them are not marfu'. Most of them are Athar of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. That's why we see this here is an action of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Right? This is the action of Umar ibn al-Khattab that he mentions here. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي الحسن علي بن عمر بن أحمد الدارقطني بسننه أوله كتاب الطهارة قال حدثني الحسين بن إسماعيل قال حدثنا يعقوب بن إبراهيم الدورقي قال حدثنا أبو أسامة وحدثنا أحمد بن علي بن العلاء قال حدثنا أبو عبيدة بن أبي السفر قال حدثنا أبو أسامة وحدثنا أبو عبد الله أو أبو عبيد الله المعدل أحمد بن عمر بن عثمان بواسط قال حدثنا محمد بن عبادة قال حدثنا أبو أسامة وحدثنا أبو بكر النيسابوري عبد الله بن محمد بن زياد قال حدثنا حاجب بن سليمان قال حدثنا أبو أسامة قال حدثنا الوليد بن كثير عن محمد بن جعفر بن الزبير عن عبد الله بن عمر عن أبيه رضي الله عنه قال سئل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن الماء يكون بأرض فلات وما ينوبه من السباع والدواب فقال إذا كان الماء قلتين لم ينجسه شيء قال ابن أبي السفر لم يحمل الخبث قال ابن عبادة مثله. The next one is the Sunan of Imam al-Daraqutni. Imam al-Daraqutni rahimahullah ta'ala, he, as you can see, he's from the next century, right? 385 is when he passed away. But Imam al-Daraqutni, he was a great imam in the field of hadith, and also a great imam in the field of fiqh, and also a qari. He's also well known as being an imam of the different qira'at. So Imam al-Daraqutni, is a person who would be well deserving to be called Shaykh al-Islam. And many people say Imam al-Daraqutni is the difference between al-mutaqaddimin and al-mutaakhirin. So when you talk about the early scholars, al-mutaqaddimin, the early scholars, versus al-mutaakhirin, the ones who came later, they kind of say al-Daraqutni is he's like that karaf. He's the last of the mutaqaddimin. He's the last, real imam of ilal al-hadith and al-jarh wa ta'dil. Anyone who comes after him is just referring to the scholars before them. So, that's why when we talk about, valid criticisms of the Sahihain, and we talk about ad-Daraqutni, because he's kind of like the last one who was of that level, and within that time frame, that can make these valid criticisms. Anyone else who's, coming and criticizing, they're just referring back to ad-Daraqutni or any of these other imams before. So Imam ad-Daraqutni, he has his book about Sunan, and this book is very useful for a couple reasons. Now, the first hadith that he mentions in here is this hadith, إِذَا كَانَ الْمَاءُ قُلَّتَيْنِ لَمْ يُنَجِّسْهُ شَيْءٍ. So this is a hadith where the scholars have had a long dispute about whether or not it's authentic, because there's a lot of discrepancies in the isnad. So the first hadith he mentions is this, and obviously the author doesn't mention all the paths that ad-Daraqutni, but he basically mentions everything about this hadith. So you can, see all of the different narrations of the hadith, and then, talks about it in terms of authenticity or not. And he does this for many other hadiths as well. Right? So Imam al-Daraqutni, rahimahullah ta'ala, he kind of, just like how we talked about Imam al-Nasa'i doing in Sunan al-Kubra, Imam al-Daraqutni does similar to that. He also mentions lots of the hadiths that the madhahib and the fuqaha rely on as evidence for their madhab. And many of these are weak, right? Which is also kind of useful if you go over a book of fiqh, right? Where this faqih is trying to prove their madhab. They mention a hadith and they don't say this is sahih, they don't say this is da'if, they just say this is the hadith, this is the proof for our madhab. And you might not know, where do I find this? Imam al-Daraqutni will have that, and you can look at the isnad and see if it's authentic or not with the book of Imam al-Daraqutni. So Imam al-Daraqutni, he has other books as well which are also very useful in this field of of hadith. Some people said he has some tasahul. He's very lenient in this book of his, As-Sunan. And then he has another book called At-Tatabbu', which we talked about earlier, where he's criticizing Bukhari and Muslim. And they say in that he has tashaddud. He's strict, overly strict in that. And then he has a book called Al-Ilal, where he talks about any hadith which has some kind of defect in it. And in the end, he talks about, is this a real defect that actually hurts the authenticity of the hadith, or is the hadith still valid? And they say in that book Al-Ilal, that's kind of he follows a good middle path in that, where he's not overly strict and he's not overly lenient. And that book Al-Ilal is the most extensive work written on the defects in hadith, and it's a 9-volume work where he mentions all of the paths of the hadith, who said this, who said that, and then he says which one is correct, which one is a mistake, based on who those narrators are. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحافظ أبي نعيم في كتابه المستخرج على صحيح مسلم كتاب الإيمان قال حدثنا أحمد بن يوسف بن خلاد قال حدثنا الحارث بن أبي أسامة قال حدثنا أبو عبد الرحمن المقري عبد الله بن يزيد وحدثنا أبو علي بن الصواف قال حدثنا بشر بن موسى قال حدثنا أبو عبد الرحمن المقري قال حدثنا كهمس بن الحسن عن عبد الله بن بريدة الأسلمي عن يحيى بن يعمر القرشي قال كان أول من قال في القدر معبد الجهني بالبصرة فانطلقت أنا وحميد بن عبد الرحمن الحميري حجاجا فلما قدمنا قلنا لو لقينا بعض أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فسألناه عما يقول هؤلاء في القدر هؤلاء القوم في القدر فلما دخلنا المسجد إذا نحن بعبد الله بن عمر رضي الله عنهما فأتيناه فسلمنا عليه فاكتنفته أنا وصاحبي إلى آخر ما مر في حديث مسلم. Who's Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani? When did we see him? Just today. Like, when did we see Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani? Yeah, he's one of the ones good who collected the Musnad of Imam Abu Hanifa. He has another very famous book. Does anyone know? Huh? I believe so, but there's another one I'm thinking. It's a book of biographies. Hilyatul Awliya. Hilyatul Awliya. It's basically biographies of the very pious people. But some people criticize that in those biographies he mentions a lot of kind of fabricated stories that contain some exaggerations and stuff like that. But he's a great imam of hadith and of fiqh. So this book is Al-Mustakhraj. Does anyone know what Al-Mustakhraj means in hadith terminology? When we talk about a book of hadith being a mustakhraj of a certain of a book, what does that mean? He says it's a mustakhraj of Sahih Muslim. You're just translating mustakhraj basically? Yeah. So, no. Okay, so this is very important because a lot of, again, we see people criticizing Imam al-Bukhari, Imam Muslim. People have no idea, right? Ask them, what is a mustakhraj? They won't be able to tell you, because if they knew what a mustakhraj was, there's no way they could criticize Imam Muslim or Imam al-Bukhari. Mustakhraj is basically someone who came a generation or two after that Imam, recreating their book without using that Imam themselves. So basically what he's doing, he's going to say, I'm going to recreate Sahih Muslim. Yes, I have an isnad where I can narrate Sahih Muslim through Imam Muslim, but now I'm going to find that same hadith with a different isnad, other than going through Imam Muslim. So we can compare, to the Sahih Muslim that is mentioned here and here. You can see it's the same hadith, but this doesn't go through Imam Muslim, right? So the primary goal is, let's say Imam Muslim narrates this hadith from Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shaybah. So now, Abu Nu'aym, here he is, he can say, here's my Shaykh, here's Imam Muslim, here's Ibn Abi Shaybah. But I'm going to show you, that other scholars also narrated the exact same hadith from Ibn Abi Shaybah, the same way Imam Muslim did. Now why are they doing this? Because this critique that exists now didn't exist in that time. Nobody was saying Imam Muslim, Imam Bukhari fabricated these books. So of course that wasn't their aim. That might be a good way for us to use it now, but that's not why he did it back then. Back then, the reason they would do this is to say, if I narrate Sahih Muslim through Imam Muslim, I have, let's say, 2 people in between me and Imam Muslim, which means I have 3 people in between me and Imam Muslim Shaykh. But I can narrate the same hadith with only 2 people between me and Imam Muslim Shaykh. Or sometimes I can narrate it, with this, skip over one person where my isnad and Imam Muslim's isnad is the same length. So this is kind of their primary goal, is to basically say, I can narrate Sahih Muslim with the same isnad or the same length of isnad as Imam Muslim, even though I'm like 100 years after him. But now we can say, these mustakhrajat, and it's not just one, there's many of them. And they did mustakhraj of Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, multiple people doing it with all different isnad. So, this is just, again, showing that Imam al-Bukhari, Imam Muslim were not, none of this is from their own opinion or their own minds. Yes? That's a good question, but usually not, no. Because usually, Sahih al-Bukhari, his isnads are automatically going to be shorter than Imam Muslim. But, like you said, what if I'm doing mustakhraj of Sahih Muslim? Could I go through Sahih al-Bukhari? I don't know that they've ever done that, but Allahu A'lam. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي مسلم الكشي أو الكجي في سننه قال الحافظ أبو مسلم في باب فضل الصدقة وهو أول الثلاثيات قال حدثنا عمرو بن محمد العثماني قال حدثنا عبد الله بن نافع الزبيري عن عبد الله بن محمد بن يحيى بن عروة عن هشام بن عروة عن عبيد الله بن رافع الأنصاري أنه أخبره عن جابر بن عبد الله رضي الله عنهما أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من أحيا أرضا ميتة فله أجر وما أكلت العافية منها فهو له صدقة. Before this, another thing about the mustakhraj, for us, right, if we're just kind of like casual students of طلاب العلم, we might not need these. But if you're a very serious student of hadith, the muhaddith refers to these. And Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, he frequently refers to these in his sharh of Sahih al-Bukhari. And there's a benefit of that. If you are doing an in-depth study of Sahih al-Bukhari, and you're referring back to all these different manuscripts, and now you might see, okay, this manuscript has hadiths in a different order. So if I see look at the mustakhrajat of Sahih al-Bukhari, I can kind of use those to weigh between differences found in manuscripts. So this is something my Shaykh, who's an expert of Jami' al-Tirmidhi, he always will refer back to the mustakhraj of Imam al-Tusi, who has a mustakhraj of Jami' al-Tirmidhi. So sometimes Imam al-Tirmidhi, he says this hadith is Hasan or Hasan Sahih. And sometimes one manuscript will say Hasan and one will say Hasan Sahih. So the Shaykh will say, how do we know which one of these is correct? Let's see what al-Tusi said. Because al-Tusi was, basically a generation or two after, so he's able to has access to those early ones. So this next one we see is the Musnad of Imam Abu Muslim al-Kashi here with a sheen. I also said al-Kajji. This particular book, in our time, it's not published. The handwritten manuscript might exist, and I would try to look online, does anyone know where this manuscript is? And some people asked about it, but nobody really gave an answer. But it must have existed at least a couple hundred years ago, because the author here had access to it, right? But the most discussion now is just on his name, Al-Kashi or Al-Kajji. So his name is Ibrahim ibn Abdullah ibn Muslim ibn Ma'iz ibn Kash, with this sheen. So some of them say he's Kashi, meaning one of, related to this relative of his, Kash. And some say no, he's Al-Kajji with a jeen, Kajji. And they say the reason he's called that is because Kaj, they say, Kaj in Persian means gypsum. They would use gypsum to build a house. So it says he was building a house. There's a lot of Persian scholars. He's building a house and he would say, Hati al-Kaj. Give me the gypsum, give me the gypsum. Hati al-Kaj. And he kept saying it so much that they started saying, oh, you're al-Kajji. Like they call him al-Kajji, meaning gypsum. So of course nowadays we have, Google Translate. So I do, how do you say gypsum in Persian? Just check it out. It's gach, gach. Ga does not exist in Arabic, and cha does not exist in Arabic, right? What is cha? Cha is the same makhraj as jim and sheen, but which is the middle of the tongue touching the roof of the mouth. So because it's somewhere in between this sheen, which is a voiceless letter, and jim, which is a voiced letter. So the makhraj is closer to jim, but the sifat is closer to sheen. So cha is somewhere in between the two. So maybe when the Arabs are Arabizing this word gach, it becomes kaj, kaj. So kajji, meaning gypsum, and for that reason we could also say some might hear, if this is an Arab and doesn't know the cha sound, or they're trying to figure out how to write it, do we write as a sheen or as a jim? So some might write it kashi and some might write it kajji. Allahu alam. There's, again, this is not really a very important other than knowing who this person is, but this is why sometimes you might find kashi or sometimes kajji. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الحافظ الكبير سعيد بن منصور في سننه باب الأذان وهو أول سنن قال حدثنا هشيم بن بشير قال حدثنا حسين بن عبد الرحمن قال أخبرنا عبد الرحمن بن أبي ليلى أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم اهتم للصلاة كيف يجمع الناس لها فقال لقد هممت أن أبعث رجالا فيقوم كل واحد منهم على أطم من آطام المدينة فيؤذن كل رجل منهم من يليه فلم يعجبه ذلك فذكروا الناقوس فلم يعجبه ذلك فانصرف عبد الله بن زيد مهتما لهم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فأري الأذان في منامه فلما أصبح غدا فقال يا رسول الله رأيت رجلا على سقف المسجد عليه ثوبان أخضران ينادي بالأذان فزعم أنه أذن مثنى الأذان كله ثم قعد قعدة ثم عاد فقال مثل قوله الأول فلما بلغ حي على الفلاح قال قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله فقام عمر بن الخطاب فقال يا رسول الله وأنا قد أطاف بي الليلة مثل الذي أطاف به فقال ما منعك أن تخبرنا فقال سبقني عبد الله بن زيد فاستحييت فأعجب بذلك المسلمون فكانت سنة بعد وأمر بلالا فأذن. The next book is the Sunan of Sa'id ibn Mansur. So the physical copy of Sunan Sa'id ibn Mansur, which I have in my house, is 2 volumes, and it starts in like the Mu'amalat, in like Kitab al-Jihad. The author, the Muhaqqiq, this is published in like 1982, something like that. I got it from an older Shaykh, he gave it to me, and I read the introduction of the Muhaqqiq, and he says, we found the 3rd part of a 4-part book. Right? So meaning we couldn't find the first and second part of it. We only found this 3rd part of the 4 parts. So this is what's published. This is back in 1980 something, right? So, and the Shaykh, he talks, about the manuscripts, the handwritten thing, everything like that. But now, if you Google Sunan Sa'id ibn Mansur, you'll find a newer publication, which has more. And they refer back to this original one. They say, Shaykh Habibur Rahman al-A'zami, that's the Muhaqqiq who found this one, the old one. They said Habibur Rahman al-A'zami, he said this, we found this, but alhamdulillah, a brother in, I believe in Riyadh, mentioned to him, he said that there's a library so-and-so, someone has a private library with the Sunan there. And he says, we went there and we looked and, compared it and it was all there. It's still missing a few parts. So that one doesn't seem to start with Kitab al-Tahara like this. He mentions, Fadailul Quran and stuff like that at the beginning. So Allahu A'lam, maybe there's still some parts that are missing, but we can see from this that those parts, existed in the time that the author is there. So, it's just going through these handwritten manuscripts. And one of the things that they mention, actually this Sa'id ibn Mansur, that Habibur Rahman al-A'zami, he says usually these libraries, like the libraries in Damascus and in Turkey, they're very well cataloged. So even these manuscripts that aren't published yet, they have it cataloged. Like for example, the Sunan Sa'id ibn Mansur is sitting on this shelf, this place. And he says 99% of the time it's accurate. But sometimes it will say it, and there might be a cover, and it's actually doesn't match what's inside. And nobody really went and looked through it yet. So he said, what happened is they're in one of these libraries, they had what they thought was the Musannaf of Abdul Razak as-San'ani. And they said, but this manuscript, the layout is pretty much the same, but it doesn't seem to, the sanads don't match the other manuscripts. So what is this? So they do this research, and they find that all of the isnads match the isnads that we know of Sa'id ibn Mansur, who's from the Shuyukh of Bukhari and them, right? So that hadiths that we know as being hadiths of Sa'id ibn Mansur from the other books where Sa'id ibn Mansur, for example, is the Shaykh of Imam al-Bukhari. So then they start looking at also the isnad of the manuscript itself. And they find the person who's narrating this manuscript from Sa'id ibn Mansur is one of Sa'id ibn Mansur's students. So they say, oh, this is Sunan Sa'id ibn Mansur, but it accidentally got labeled as the Musannaf of Abdul Razak. So this is how Habib ar-Rahman al-A'zami found that in the one he published. But now, again later, there was one, they knew it was the book of Sa'id ibn Mansur, and now alhamdulillah, it's more completely published, and they can also use the one found by Habib ar-Rahman as supporting. So anyway, we see this is one of the early scholars, passed away in the year 227, right? So before Imam al-Bukhari, before Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah ta'ala. وبالسند المتقدم إلى ابن أبي شيبة في مصنفه وهو أبو بكر عبد الله بن محمد بن أبي شيبة كتاب الطهارة ما يقول الرجل إذا دخل الخلاء. قال حدثنا هشيم بن بشير عن عبد العزيز بن سهيب عن أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه قال كان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا دخل الخلاء قال أعوذ بالله من الخبث والخبائث. The next one is the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba. And again, we see this is an earlier scholar. This is one of the sheikhs of Imam Muslim. And again, if we want to say, look at Imam Muslim, look at Sahih Muslim, and look where he narrates from his sheikh Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, and then go look at the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, which was written, and you see that they match. Right? So again, one of those proofs. So Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba, as I mentioned, is one of the largest collection of books we have, larger than the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. But the Musnad of Imam Ahmad is marfu hadiths, whereas many marfu hadiths are found in it, like this first one he mentions, but there's also lots of athar from Sahaba, fatawa from Sahaba and Tabi'een. That's why for a person who's a mufti, right, if a person is giving fatawa, it is essential that a person shouldn't give fatawa without owning this Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba and referring to it. Why? Because if the Sahaba radiallahu anhum have already given a fatwa on this mas'ala, and you're asked to give a fatwa, shouldn't you refer back to those Sahaba who were giving that fatwa? Right? So this is one of the benefits. And that's, in fact, in books of fiqh, again, some people might study books of the madhab, and you'll see, oftentimes they'll say, this is the opinion of Umar and Aisha and Ibn Umar. But Abu Huraira and Ibn Abbas said this. Right? So you might wonder, how do they know? How do they know that those Sahaba had those opinions? This is how. This is the reference for that. So the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba and the Musannaf of Abdul Razak as-San'ani. Those books are very similar to each other in that sense. And these are the basically necessary tools for the mufti and for the faqih. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام البغوي الفراء محيي السنة الحسين بن مسعود في كتابه شرح السنة أوله في حديث إنما الأعمال بالنيات قال أخبرنا أبو سعيد أحمد بن محمد بن العباس الخطيب الحميدي قال أخبرنا أبو عبد الله محمد بن عبد الحافظ قال أخبرنا أبو عبد الله محمد بن عبد الله الأصبهاني قال حدثنا إسماعيل بن إسحاق القاضي قال حدثنا القعنبي عن مالك عن يحيى بن سعيد وأخبرنا أبو بكر محمد بن عبد الله بن أبي تربة الكشميهني واللفظ لا قال أخبرنا أبو طاهر محمد بن أحمد بن الحارث قال أخبرنا أبو الحسن محمد بن يعقوب الكسائي الباباني قال أخبرنا أبو عبد الرحمن عبد الله بن محمود قال أخبرنا أبو إسحاق إبراهيم بن عبد الله الخلال قال أخبرنا عبد الله بن المبارك عن يحيى بن سعيد عن محمد بن إبراهيم التيمي عن علقمة بن أبي وقاص الليثي عن عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى فمن كانت هجرته إلى الله ورسوله فهجرته إلى الله ورسوله ومن كانت هجرته إلى دنيا يصيبها أو امرأة ينكحها فهجرته إنما هجر إليه. وبالسند إليه, it's the same author, so I'll just read both of these. وبالسند إليه في المصابيح له عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال وددت أني رأيت إخواننا قالوا يا رسول الله ألسنا إخوانك قال أنتم أصحابي وإخواننا الذين يأتون من بعد وأنا فرطهم على الحوض. The next author is Al-Baghawi, Al-Husayn ibn Mas'ud Al-Baghawi. He mentions two of his books here. One is Sharh al-Sunnah and the other is Al-Masabih. Both of these are available, exist, and beneficial books. We can see this is a later scholar, right? 510 Hijri, but this is kind of one of those exceptions to the rule. This is a person in the 6th century who still narrates with isnad. The first book, Sharh al-Sunnah, with isnad. The second one, he doesn't mention the isnad, but the first one, he mentions the isnad in these hadiths. That's why you see it's really long, right? The second one, you see there's no isnad in it, because that's not really the purpose of it. So the second book, Al-Masabih, another book was written around this, where someone added hadiths to it and kind of organized it in a nice way, and now that book is widely used, especially in the Indian subcontinent. So does anyone know what that book is? Al-Masabih. So basically it's blank. Al-Masabih is the title. Mishkatul Masabih. Good. Mishkatul Masabih. So Al-Masabih by Al-Baghawi, this is the asal of it, right? This is the foundation of it. Then At-Tabrizi wrote Mishkatul Masabih. And now that has become this that's the book to study. And other scholars have wrote Sharh of Mishkatul Masabih. One of them, Ali Al-Qari, مرقات المفاتيح في شرح مشكاة المصابيح. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحافظ أبي داود الطيالسي في كتابه المسمى بمسند قال في حديث الاستغفار عقب صلاة ركعتين من مسند أبي بكر الصديق رضي الله عنه وهو أول. قال حدثنا شعبة قال أخبرنا عثمان بن المغيرة قال سمعت علي بن ربيعة الأسري يحدث عن أسماء أو ابن أسماء الفزاري قال سمعت عليا رضي الله عنه يقول كنت إذا سمعت من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حديثا ينفعني الله بما شاء أن ينفعني. قال علي وحدثني أبو بكر وصدق أبو بكر أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال ما من عبد يذنب ذنبا ثم يتوضأ ثم يصلي ركعتين ثم يستغفر الله إلا غفر له. ثم تلا هذه الآية والذين إذا فعلوا فاحشة أو ظلموا أنفسهم الآية. والآية الأخرى ومن يعمل سوءا يظلم نفسه الآية. So the next book is also from one of the early scholars, one of the first scholars to collect the Musnad, to collect the book of the Musnad, Abu Dawud al-Tayalisi. We see he passed away in the year 204. So the scholars of Al-Kutub al-Sitta, when they narrate from Abu Dawud al-Tayalisi, there's a Shaykh between them and between Abu Dawud al-Tayalisi. Right? So, just to show kind of generationally how he's from before those scholars. But these ahadith that are found in the Musnad of Abu Dawud al-Tayalisi, again, the scholars, these are also found in Al-Kutub al-Sitta, but they're narrating it with two names between them and the author Abu Dawud al-Tayalisi. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الحافظ عبد بن حميد بن نصر الكسي في مسنده المسمى بالمنتخب أوله مسند أبي بكر الصديق رضي الله عنه قال أخبرنا يزيد بن هارون قال أخبرنا إسماعيل بن أبي خالد عن قيس بن أبي حازم عن أبي بكر الصديق رضي الله عنه قال إنكم تقرؤون هذه الآية يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم وإني سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول إن الناس إذا رأوا الظالم فلم يأخذوا على يديه أوشك أن يعمهم الله بعقابه. This same hadith preceded earlier from the Musnad of Abu Bakr. So this is the Musnad of Abd ibn Humayd al-Kissi, which refers to the area he's from. So this looks like al-Kashi if we didn't have the harakat. But with the harakat and the dots, we can see the difference. So this is called Mustalah al-Hadith al-Mu'talif wal-Mukhtalif. So his book is published, found Imam al-Nawawi in Arba'in al-Nawawi. If this name Abd ibn Humayd sounds familiar to anyone, one of the hadiths in Arba'in al-Nawawi, he narrates it and he says, Rawahu Abd ibn Humayd. Right? So this is found in our time. وبالسند المتقدم نعم المنتخب المنتخب وبالسند المتقدم إلى الحارث أبي محمد ابن أبي أسامة رحمه الله في مسنده وهو غير مرتب في مسند عبد الله بن عمر أولا قال حدثنا يزيد بن هارون قال حدثنا زكريا بن أبي زائدة عن الشعبي عن عبد الله بن عمرو رضي الله عنهما قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم المسلم من سلم المسلمون من لسانه ويده والمهاجر من هجر ما نهى الله عنه. So the next one is the Musnad of Al-Harith ibn Abi Usama. So this is called Al-Musnad Al-Harith ibn Abi Usama. And this, I think, recently has been published. So you can find the PDF online that's available. One of the points in here it says Abdullah ibn Umar. Right? The Sahabi who actually narrates the hadith, it's well known that it's Abdullah ibn Amr. So there should be a waw written after it. Now, is this a mistake from the publisher? That's one possibility. Is it a mistake found in the manuscript of As-Sunbuliyya? Or did Muhammad Sa'id Sunbul find the mistake in the Musnad of in the manuscript of Al-Harith ibn Abi Usama, and he's basically copy and pasting the mistake? Right? So does this make sense? We have three possibilities. Who made the mistake? We know what the correct one is, but is it the publisher of this book made a mistake? Does it say with a wow here? Yeah. So is the publisher of this book made a mistake? Is the mistake from the manuscript, like Sa'id Sunbul made the mistake? Or is he saying this is how it is in the Musnad of Al-Harith ibn Abi Usama, that the mistake is from that? So one of the mashayikh that I read this book, Al-Awailu Sunbuliyya to, he mentioned several mistakes that are like this in there. And he's like, these are clear mistakes. And his Shaykh, who is one of the ones who did the tahqiq on this, Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, very famous muhaqqiq, right? He said, this is not befitting. If you see something, right, you find the manuscript and there's a clear mistake in the manuscript, you should fix it. And rather than leave it as it is and then put a footnote saying, this is how it is in the manuscript, but the correct one is this. But this is actually two different madhabs. This is two different madhabs. So one madhab is your job, right? Your job is only to narrate it exactly as it is. Your job is not to fix a mistake. You narrate as it is, and then you can say, that's how I heard it, but the correct is this. Why is that? Why is that? Because maybe you think it's a mistake and it's not a mistake. So if you go around fixing mistakes, you might end up actually being the one who took it from the correct thing and made it a mistake. But what if you know, without a doubt, this is a mistake? There's no possible way this is correct, right? What is the benefit? What benefit do you have by not correcting the mistake? Like, for example, a typo. Remember we saw earlier, فَلَمْ يَقْرَأَهَا, or something like that, when it should have been فَلَمْ يَقْرَأْهَا, right? What is if we said, okay, let's rewrite this, do we say, let's leave it as a fatha because that's how it is on the page, copy and paste the mistake? Or do we say, I know it's a mistake. There's no possible way that this wasn't anything other than a typo, so I should fix it. Right? So this is, just two basically different opinions and approaches on how to deal with this. But some of them, they will fix it. And then in the footnotes, like here, so if you saw, there's a footnote that basically he points it out in the footnote. But this is, it's just two different approaches of how to deal with it. Allahu A'lam. Okay. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحافظ الثقة أبي بكر البزار رحمه الله تعالى في مسند أبي بكر الصديق رضي الله عنه برواية أمير المؤمنين عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه قال حدثنا سلمة بن شبيب قال حدثنا عبد الرزاق قال أخبرنا معمر عن الزهري عن سالم عن ابن عمر عن عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنه قال لما تأيمت حفصة بن خنيس بن حذافة السهمي لما تأيمت حفصة من خنيس بن حذافة السهمي وكان من أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قد شهد بدرا فتوفي بالمدينة قال عمر فلقيت عثمان بن عفان فعرضت عليه حفصة فقلت إن شئت أنكحتك حفصة بنت عمر فقال سأنظر في أمري فلبثت ليالي ثم لقيني فقال إني لا أريد أن أتزوج في يومي هذا ثم لقيت أبا بكر فعرضت عليه حفصة فقلت إن شئت أنكحتك حفصة بنت عمر فصمت أبو بكر فلم يرجع إلي شيئا فكنت عليه أوجد مني على عثمان فلبثت ليالي ثم خطبها إلي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فأنكحتها إياه فلقيني أبو بكر فقال لعلك وجدت علي حين عرضت علي حفصة وما منعني إلا أني كنت علمت من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قد ذكر حفصة فلم أكن لأفشي سر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ولو تركها قبلتها أو نكحتها. The next is the book of Imam al-Bazzar. So this Musnad al-Bazzar, the Musnad of Imam al-Bazzar, is also very beneficial. You can see he's still from the 3rd century, but this one he mentions a lot about the ahadith. For example, he'll say this hadith is gharib, meaning this hadith only so and so narrates it, or only so and so narrates it like this. And some he'll make other comments on the narrators of the hadith and the any ilal of the hadith. So there's lots of benefit in his book in terms of that, right? From the aspect of analyzing the hadiths and analyzing the different paths of the hadith. وَبِالسَّنَدِ الْمُتَقَدِّمِ Some of the scholars later who came, they would have just, for example, the Zawaid of Musnad al-Bazzar, right? So they say, okay, we know you have al-Kutub al-Sitta, and this book is a very large book, right? The Musnad of Imam al-Bazzar is a large book, so maybe it's difficult for you to go through that, right? So here's the Zawaid. Here's the ones found in Musnad of al-Bazzar that are not found in al-Kutub al-Sitta. So those are also beneficial works of later scholars that did like that. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي يعلى الموصلي في مسند أبي بكر الصديق رضي الله عنه قال حدثنا الحسن بن شبيب قال حدثنا هشيم قال حدثنا كوثر بن حكيم عن نافع عن ابن عمر رضي الله عنهما عن أبي بكر الصديق رضي الله عنه قال قلت يا رسول الله ما نجاة هذا الأمر الذي نحن فيه قال من شهد أن لا إله إلا الله فهو له نجاة. Another musnad of Ahmad ibn Ali Abu Ya'la al-Mawsili rahimahullah ta'ala, and this is one of the actually one of the students of this is Imam al-Nasai, subhanallah, Imam al-Dhahabi. He says that he's actually older than Imam al-Nasai and he has a higher isnad than Imam al-Nasai. But this shows how some scholars, because of their level of scholarship and status, like Imam al-Nasa'i, even though Abu Ya'la al-Mawsili maybe is older and has a higher isnad, but why is the book of al-Nasa'i so widely accepted? Because of the ilm of Imam al-Nasa'i. And this is not, putting down the knowledge of Abu Ya'la al-Mawsili, but, Allah Ta'ala, accepts from some people because of the effort that they put in this work. But regardless, we can also see another thing. You see in all these musnads, they're all starting with the musnad of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. So some of the scholars, when they would arrange these masanid, these musnads, they would arrange them in alphabetical order by the Sahaba. And some would arrange them maybe by virtue, by status, or maybe by when they accepted Islam. Right? So there's also different benefits, from the books based on that. وبالسند المتقدم إليه في معجمه في أوله قال حدثنا محمد بن المنهال قال حدثنا يزيد بن زريع قال حدثنا عمارة بن أبي حفصة عن عكرمة عن عائشة رضي الله عنها قالت قلت يا رسول الله أخبرني عن ابن عمي عبد الله بن جدعان قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وما كان؟ قالت قلت كان ينحر الكوماء ويكرم الجار ويقري الضيف ويصدق الحديث ويوفي الذمة ويصل الرحم ويفك العاني ويطعم الطعام ويؤدي الأمانة. قال هل قال يوما واحدا اللهم إني أعوذ بك من نار جهنم؟ قلت لا. وما كان يدري ما جهنم؟ قال فلا إذا. أورده في أول المعجم لعدم انتفاع الكافر بعمله. Then the same author, Abu Ya'la al-Mawsili, also has Mu'jam. Right, so the Mu'jam, like I mentioned earlier, Imam al-Tabarani has al-Ma'ajim. So Imam al-Tabarani has 3 books called al-Ma'ajim: al-Mu'jam al-Saghir, al-Mu'jam al-Awsat, and al-Mu'jam al-Kabir. Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir by al-Mu'jam al-Saghir and al-Awsat by al-Tabarani follows the same structure as this. So they would say the Mu'jam, and they basically organize it not by the Sahabi narrating the hadith, but by their Shaykh who they heard the hadith from. So they would say, these are all, all the hadiths I heard from Shaykh so-and-so. These are all the hadiths I heard from Shaykh so-and-so. And again, they would do that in alphabetical order. So someone might say, how is Muhammad ibn Minhal his first, Shaykh, right? If we're doing it in alphabetical order, because they start with the name Muhammad. So these are all my Shaykhs named Muhammad, and then after that we'll go in alphabetical order from Ibrahim, Ahmed, etc. Right? So same thing, Imam al-Tabarani and al-Saghir and al-Awsat. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الحافظ أبي عبد الرحمن عبد الله بن المبارك الحنظلي المروزي في حديث القيام بالقرآن وفضل شريح الحضرمي، وهو أول الجزء من كتاب الزهد والرقائق للحافظ المذكور. قال أخبرنا يونس عن الزهري قال أخبرنا السائب بن يزيد أن شريحا الحضرمي ذكر عند رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال ذلك رجل لا يتوسد القرآن. Again, this is one of the earlier scholars who collected a book of hadith on a specific topic. Right, so zuhd and al-raqa'iq, right, hadith of heart softeners and things which disattachment from the dunya, from this great imam, a huge scholar of hadith, of fiqh, one of the scholars who basically, the way Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala describes him, he says, ثقة ثبت فقيه عالم جواد مجاهد جمعت فيه خصال الخير. This is what Ibn Hajar says about him. He says he's a strong thiqah narrator, he's a faqih, he's an alim, he's jawad, he's generous. He actually funded other people to do hajj and to seek knowledge, right, by with his money. And he's a mujahid, and he participated in jihad. Then he says jumi'at fihi khisal al-khayr. Every type of good thing, it's like is found in Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. So this is one of the great scholars. There's actually a story. I know we're kind of running short on time, but one of the Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, one of these people, he performed Hajj or Umrah with Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, and Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, he had money, and they knew he had money. So he says, I'm going to take you all for Hajj. Said everybody who's coming, the money, bring your money, and we're going to put all your money in a box and write your name on the envelope or whatever, so we know whose money is whose, and then we'll go perform Hajj. We have all the money here. So he would go, and then they'd go to one place, and he would pay for whatever they need, pay for everything, buy all the food. Then he would go to Medina, and he would ask the people, what did your family want from Medina? And he would buy whatever the family wants from Medina. And then he'd go to Mecca, and he said, what does your family want from Mecca? And then they'd go to another place on the way, what does your family want from here? And he would, funded everything, bought all the gifts, all the souvenirs, whatever they need. And then at the end, he opens the box, and he gives everybody the money back that they had brought for Hajj. This is Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak, rahimahullah ta'ala. And this is an alim dedicating his life to the deen, right? So we see it's not, you have to be, either an abid worshipping Allah and you're broke, or you're rich and you forget about your deen, right? This is a person who had money, worked, but his life was the deen, right? It wasn't his life is money, his life is about getting money. He had money, but he used that money in a way pleasing to Allah Azza wa Jalla. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الحافظ أبي عبد الله الحكيم الترمذي في كتابه نوادر الأصول قال رحمه الله تعالى في حديث التحصن من لدغ العقرب وغيرها وهو أول الأصل الأول قال حدثنا قتيبة بن سعيد عن مالك بن أنس عن سهيل بن أبي صالح عن أبيه عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال رجل يا رسول الله ما نمت البارحة قال من أي شيء قال لدغتني عقرب قال أما إنك لو قلت حين أمسيت أعوذ بكلمات الله التامات كلها من شر ما خلق لم يضرك شيء. The next one, نوادر الأصول by Hakim al-Tirmidhi. Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi is not Muhammad ibn Isa al-Tirmidhi, right? They're from the same place, which is Tirmidh, which is in present-day Uzbekistan. Right? That's why they're both called Tirmidhi, but they're not the same person. So Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, actually, he had some issues of aqidah to the point that some of the scholars actually basically said he left Islam. And the other scholars, more balanced approach, saying he didn't, right? Maybe people misunderstood what he said. Because he wrote a book called Khatmatul al-Wilaya, something like this, right? Where he says there's such a thing as Khatamul Awliya. Right? You know how we have Khatamun Nabiyyin? He says there's Khatamul Awliya, right? There's this the seal of the Awliya. Right? And then, kind of says things that make it seem like he's saying the Awliya are higher than the prophets and stuff like that, which are, the statements of basically clearly against fundamentals of belief, right? But some say, no, you're misunderstanding what he said, etc. Regardless, they say out of his books, though, this book is the best of his books. Right, that this book is not like those ones where, he was highly criticized for it. That this book is okay, but they say there's still some issues in it. And this is why you won't really find anyone referring to this book that there's some, authentic hadiths or some benefits of the deen that are found in this book that aren't found anywhere else. That's why you probably don't see this book frequently quoted unless it's, in some books of tasawwuf and things like that. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي القاسم الطبراني في كتابه المسمى بالدعاء بأنه ألف في الأدعية الواردة عنه صلى الله عليه وسلم أوله باب تأويل قول الله تعالى ادعوني أستجب لكم الآية. قال حدثنا عبد الله بن محمد بن سعيد بن أبي مريم قال حدثنا محمد بن يوسف الفريابي وحدثنا علي بن عبد العزيز قال حدثنا أبو حذيفة قال حدثنا أبو حذيفة قال حدثنا سفيان عن منصور عن ذر بن عبد الله المرهبي عن يسيع الحضرمي عن النعمان بن بشير قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم العبادة هي الدعاء ثم قرأ ادعوني الآية. So Imam al-Tabarani, as I said, he has his 3 books, Al-Mu'jam, Al-Saghir, Wal-Awsat, Wal-Kabir. The author didn't mention those 3. Instead, he mentions this book, which is Ad-Du'a. Of course, Imam al-Tabarani has several books, and this is an excellent book of Imam al-Tabarani, and it's published, and you can get this book where, just you want a book of adhkar. We like books like Fortress of a Muslim, where it just, has the hadith mentioned there. But, if you want it with the isnad and seeing the hadith itself, in books like this by Imam al-Tabarani, rahimahullah ta'ala. But this is a great muhaddith that you can see. We have his name, that he lived 100 years, right? Born in the year 260 and passed away in the year 360. And he was one of the people who started seeking knowledge when he was very young, like 6, 7 years old, like this. So he would have basically the highest isnads of his time. And not only that, traveling the whole world and getting, having hadiths that nobody else had, basically. Right? Nobody else is narrating the hadith. Not that they're all authentic, but some people, they would say, nobody narrates this hadith in our time with that amount of people except for At-Tabarani. So there's this famous story. The person narrating the story, he used to be in basically kind of government position, and he was there watching this debate between Imam At-Tabarani and another scholar named Al-Ji'abi. So Al-Ji'abi was kind of a person who was into philosophy and stuff like that. And At-Tabarani is a muhaddith. So they would debate, and Imam al-Tabarani always, of course, he's outdoing him in hadith, and this guy, maybe tries to confuse him with, his philosophical arguments. So one day, al-Tabarani has basically outdone him. Imam al-Tabarani, his name is Sulaiman ibn Ahmad ibn Ayyub. Okay, this is the guy knows he's Sulaiman ibn Ahmad, right? He knows who At-Tabarani is. So this guy, Al-Diabi, he says, I have a hadith that no one else in the dunya has. He's saying this to At-Tabarani. At-Tabarani says, okay, tell me the hadith. قال حدثنا أبو خالد قال حدثنا سليمان بن أيوب قال حدثنا, and then he goes and finishes the isnad. So Tabarani goes, okay, is that it? That's the hadith? He goes, I'm Sulaiman ibn Ayyub, right? Ayyub is my grandfather. Abu Khalid, he heard this from me. He goes, if you want, Tabarani says, if you want, you can narrate the hadith from me now and you can have a higher isnad. And the guy, of course, became very embarrassed, right? And the person who's narrating the story, who was in a position of authority, he said, prior to this, there was nothing more beloved to me than like dunya, position, authority. And he said, once I saw this, I realized the real status, the real honor is ilm. So then, from there, started seeking the knowledge of hadith. But, Imam al-Tabarani, rahimahullah ta'ala, this is, one of the benefits, and I mentioned this earlier, the young people, or, the parents who have the kids, having your kids seek knowledge when they're young, especially, for things like this, isnad and memorization. This is better when at a young age. Maybe it doesn't seem beneficial now, 10 years, 20 years from now, but 90 years from now, maybe, Allah Ta'ala preserved this kid and they, lives to be 100 years old. And they have this isnad that no one else on the dunya has. This is what, recently about, 10 years ago, Shaykh Zahiruddin al-Mubarakfuri, rahimahullah ta'ala, he had the highest, no one in the dunya had the isnad he had in Sahih Muslim. Because he was basically the last person who took directly from the author of Tuhfatul Ahwadi and other books like that. And he was 102 years old when he passed away, because you learn when you're a kid, and then you reach this old age, that nobody has that same isnad. So, it's good, it's beneficial to, let the kids, seek knowledge at this young age. A lot of these imma like this, like Abu Nu'aym al-Asbahani, who we saw earlier, 6 years old, he was getting ijazat from mashayikh, and, when he was at his older age, he's, everybody's traveling the world to come to him, right? Because nobody else had those ijazas that he had. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي نعم, we just read this one. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الحافظ أبي بكر أحمد بن علي الخطيب البغدادي لكتابه المسمى اقتضاء العلم العمل. أوله قال أخبرنا القاضي أبو بكر أحمد بن الحسن بن أحمد الحريثي بنيسابور قال حدثنا أبو العباس محمد بن يعقوب الأصم. Remember Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Asam from the Musnad of Imam al-Shafi. قال حدثنا محمد بن إسحاق الصغاني قال حدثنا الأسود بن عامر قال حدثنا أبو بكر بن عياش عن الأعمش عن سعيد بن عبد الله عن أبي برزة الأسلمي رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تزال قدما عبد يوم القيامة حتى لا تزول قدم عبد يوم القيامة حتى يسأل عن أربع: عن عمره فيما أفنى، وعن علمه ماذا عمل فيه، وعن ماله من أين اكتسبه وفيما أنفقه، وعن جسمه فيما أبلاه. The next book is one of the many books of the great scholar Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi. So Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, again we see he's from the 5th century. So he's a later scholar, but Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, we would say he was like an expert in authoring books. So, rather than just here's a great collection of all these different hadiths, he would collect these hadiths in very specific, beneficial topics. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, he said that you can barely find the topic of hadith except that Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi narrated in that, right? Meaning in Mustalahul Hadith and hadith terminology, he has books, book just about Al-Muttafiq wal-Muftariq, people who share the same name. Then Al-Mudih or Al-Muwaddih fi Awhami al-Jam'i wa-Tafriq, right? The book which clarifies a person who's known by multiple names, the opposite of Al-Muttafiq wal-Muftariq. And so on and so forth. Many different things like this. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi has a book like that. And then he has books also like this. Books which are, good for motivating iman. So this is actually one of those books which is very beneficial. Iqtida'ul ilm al-amal. That knowledge necessitates action. Meaning you gain knowledge for the purpose of acting upon that knowledge. And so he has a book just about that, a hadith and athar, for the person who's learning the deen. Why are you learning it? Not just for information, not to debate other people, but to act upon the knowledge that you have. So, this is one of those very beneficial books by Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi rahimahullah ta'ala. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحافظ يحيى بن معين المري رحمه الله تعالى أول قال حدثنا ابن أبي مريم قال حدثنا ابن لهيعة عن أبي الأسود عن عروة بن الزبير عن المسور بن مخرم عن أبيه رضي الله عنه قال لقد أظهر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الإسلام فأسلم أهل مكة كلهم وذلك قبل أن تفرض الصلاة حتى كان لا يقرأ بالسجدة فيسجد القوم وما يستطيع بعضهم أن يسجد من الزحام وضيق المقام لكثرة الناس حتى قدم رؤوس قريش الوليد بن المغيرة وأبو جهل وغيرهما وكانوا بالطائف في أرضهم فقالوا أتدعون دينكم ودين آبائكم فكفروا. The next book, he says, is a book from Yahya ibn Ma'in. Yahya ibn Ma'in is a great scholar of hadith and one of the imams of the Ilal al-Hadith, the defects of hadith, and al-Jarh wa Ta'dil. But he's not known to have, like a book of hadith that he narrates. But there's books of basically su'alat. People ask Yahya ibn Ma'in about this narrator, about that narrator, about this hadith and that hadith, and those books are available. The muhaqqiq here, he says this is, we go to footnote 3, he says this is the Tarikh bi Riwayat ad-Duri. So you have this book, Tarikh Yahya ibn Ma'in by ad-Duri. So ad-Duri asks him the questions or says, these are all the things Yahya ibn Ma'in says about biographies, about history, about this and that, and he compiles it into a book. The copy I have at my house doesn't match this in terms of this being the first hadith. Allahu a'lam, right? If it's something, different order that someone put it in, Allah knows best. But, this is what he says is the first hadith. Allahu a'lam. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحجة عبد الرزاق الصنعاني قال أخبرنا معمر عن ثابت عن أنس قال كان شعر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إلى أنصاف أذنيه وهو آخر مصنفه. The next one is the Musannaf of Abdul Razaq. Abdul Razaq al-San'ani also is the Shaykh of the Shuyukh of the Al-Kutub al-Sitta. So none of the scholars of Al-Kutub al-Sitta narrate directly from Abdul Razaq. There's always one person in between them. Imam al-Tabarani, remember Imam al-Tabarani is 100 years after Imam al-Bukhari. Imam al-Tabarani also only has one person between him and Abdul Razaq al-San'ani. So that's what we call al-ulu and nisbi. How can someone 100 years? The answer is because Imam al-Tabarani started seeking knowledge when he's very young, and he's taken it from a sheikh who was seeking knowledge when he was very young, from Abdul Razaq al-San'ani when he's in an old age. So that means he has the same level of isnad as Imam al-Bukhari, even though he's 100 years younger than him. Anyway, the Musannaf of Abdul Razaq al-San'ani it's available, it's published. But here the author says this is the last hadith in the Musannaf. Why the last hadith if this is al-awa'il, right, the first hadith? Because the beginning of the Musannaf, the manuscript, is not found, right? So here he says, no, I don't think he mentions here, but some of the people said because the first quarter is missing. But one of our, mashayikh, Shaykh Muhammad Ziyad al-Tukla, hafidhahullah ta'ala, who's a great muhaqqiq and an expert in these kinds of things, he examined this and he says it seems that basically the first 2 pages or so are missing. Regardless, the very first hadith of the Musannaf of Abdul Razaq al-San'ani, as Abdul Razaq wrote it in his Musannaf, we don't have that manuscript. So therefore he said, in that case, we'll just put the last one in here. But anyway, this is also available now. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحافظ أبي بكر البيهقي في سنن الصغرى أوله كتاب الطهارة باب التطهير بماء البحر قال الله جل ثناؤه وأنزلنا من السماء ماء طهورا وقال تعالى فلم تجدوا ماء فتيمموا قال أبو عبد الله محمد بن إدريس الشافعي ظاهر القرآن يدل على أن كل ماء طهور ماء بحر وغيره وقد روي فيه عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم حديث يوافق ظاهر القرآن في إسناده من لا أعرفه. ثم ذكر الحديث الذي أخبرنا به أبو عبد الله محمد بن عبد الله الحافظ وأبو زكريا يحيى بن إبراهيم بن محمد بن يحيى قال حدثنا أبو العباس محمد بن يعقوب قال حدثنا الربيع بن سليمان قال أخبرنا الشافعي قال أخبرنا مالك وأخبرنا أبو علي الحسين بن محمد بن علي الروذباري في كتاب السنن قال أخبرنا أبو بكر محمد بن بكر بن محمد بن عبد الرزاق المعروف بابن داسة بالبصرة قال حدثنا أبو داود سليمان بن الأشعث السجستاني قال حدثنا عبد الله بن مسلمة عن مالك تمام السند مع الحديث مر في مسند الشافعي. The next one is the Musnad, the Sunan al-Kubra of al-Bayhaqi. So, we talked about the Mu'jam of al-Tabarani. We talked about the Musnad of Imam Ahmad and said these are very similar in size, right? Even though the Musnad of Imam Ahmad is slightly bigger but similar in size. Then we talked about the Musannaf of of Ibn Abi Shayba and said that this is bigger but not all marfu'. And now we have a Sunan al-Kubra, which is not as big, but these 4 books are basically considered the biggest books we have as collections of ahadith and athar. This book is considered, especially for the Shafi'i madhab, to be an absolute must. Imam al-Bayhaqi was a great scholar of hadith and a scholar of fiqh, to the point that they said, if we wanted, we could basically say the Bayhaqi madhab. Right, that this is how much of an alim he was. Yes, he was Shafi'i, but he's an alim, he's a muhaddith, a mujtahid. So his book is a reference in terms of fiqh, in terms of knowledge of hadith, etc. And of course, him being Shafi'i, he often supports the madhab of Imam Shafi'i with a hadith. We can go till 3, is that okay? Okay. وبالسند المتقدم إلى البيهقي في سنن الكبرى نعم في سننه الكبرى نعم the first one he says الصغرى and then الكبرى. So he has 2 books of hadith. Al-Kubra, actually this is the famous one. If you see Sunan al-Bayhaqi, it's referring to Al-Kubra. المجزأة ب200 جزء وجزئين في باب عدة أم الولد إذا توفي عنها سيدها وهو آخر سنن. قال أخبرنا أبو عبد الله قال أخبرنا أبو الوليد قال حدثنا محمد بن أحمد بن زهير قال حدثنا عبد الله هو بن هاشم عن وكيع عن مسعر وسفيان عن عبد الكريم عن مجاهد قال 3 أشهر انتهى ما في سنن البيهقي. لكن يقول محمد بن سعيد سنبل اعلم أن البيهقي في سننه حاول ذكر ما يدل للشافعي فيما ذهب إليه، وعند الشافعي من غير خلاف أن أم الولد إذا مات سيدها عنها تستبرأ بحيضة ولا تسمى عدة، فلعله أراد إذا توفي سيدها ثم تزوجت ثم طلقها زوجها فتعتد حينئذ ب3 أشهر لأنها صارت حرة بموت سيدها، والحديث بظاهره يدل لمذهب أبي حنيفة. So why here do you think that he's narrating the last hadith of Sunan al-Kubra? Missing the first part, right? That's what we would think, because that's what we said about the Musannaf of Abdul Razak. But we're not missing the first part. The first part is there. I don't know, all right, this is not what the Muhaqqiq said, but this is my theory because, by checking, the first hadith of As-Sughra and Al-Kubra is the same. So, he already mentioned in As-Sughra, so now he's just going to say the last for Al-Kubra. Allahu A'lam. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي بكر أحمد بن الحسين البيهقي في دلائل النبوة قال أخبرنا أبو عبد الله الحافظ قال حدثنا أبو العباس محمد بن يعقوب قال حدثنا العباس بن محمد الدوري وأخبرنا أبو بكر أحمد بن الحسن القاضي قال حدثنا أبو علي حامد بن محمد الهروي قال حدثنا محمد بن يونس قال حدثنا عثمان بن عمر قال حدثنا شعبة عن أبي جعفر الخطمي قال سمعت عمارة بن خزيمة بن ثابت يحدث عن عثمان بن حنيف أن رجلا ضريرا أتى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال ادعو الله لي أن يعافيني، فقال إن شئت أخرت ذلك وهو خير لك وإن شئت دعوت الله، قال فادعوه. قال فأمره أن يتوضأ فيحسن الوضوء ويصلي ركعتين ويدعو بهذا الدعاء اللهم إني أسألك وأتوجه إليك بنبيك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم نبي الرحمة يا محمد إني أتوجه بك إلى ربي في حاجتي فيقضيها لي اللهم فشفعه في. زاد محمد بن يونس في رواية فقام وقد أبصر. This other book, also by the same author, Imam al-Bayhaqi, is Dala'il al-Nubuwah. So he has the books of As-Sunan, then he has a book, just a collection of hadiths, proofs of the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He also has another book called Shu'abul Iman. Right? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he said, Al-Imanu bid'atun wa sab'una shu'ba. Right? The Iman is 70 something branches. So Imam al-Bayhaqi has a book mentioning every sunnah, everything that we know is associated with Iman, to show this is a branch of Iman, this is a branch of Iman. Because the Prophet ﷺ maybe said, La yu'minu ahadukum hatta. Right? One of you does not believe until. That means that's a branch of Iman. So he shows this 70 something branches in that manner. He also has another book, Al-Asma' wa Sifat, mentioning the ahadith of the Asma' and Sifat of Allah Azza wa Jal. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي عوانة في مستخرجه على صحيح مسلم قال رحمه الله حدثنا علي بن حرب وزكريا بن يحيى بن أسد وعبد السلام بن أبي فروة النصيبي قالوا حدثنا سفيان بن عيينة عن زياد بن علاقة قال سمعت جريرا رضي الله عنه يقول بايعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم على النصح لكل مسلم فأنا لكم ناصح. Another mustakhraj, this is from Ishaq ibn Ibrahim al-Isfarayini Abu Awan. So he has a mustakhraj, another one of Sahih Muslim. We saw Abu Nu'aym and now Abu Awana al-Isfarayini also. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي عبد الله محمد بن حبان التميمي لكتابه المسمى بالتقاسيم والأنواع قال في أوله أخبرنا الحسن بن سفيان قال حدثنا محمد بن أبي بكر المقدمي قال حدثنا عباد بن عباد قال حدثنا أبو جمرة عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما قال قدم وفد عبد القيس على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فقالوا يا رسول الله إن هذا الحي من ربيعة قد حالت بيننا وبينك كفار مضر ولا نخلص إليك إلا في شهر حرام فمرنا بأمر نعمل به وندعو إليه من وراءنا قال آمركم know the wording of the hadith. You could say this hadith is about salah, but there's no kitab al-salah, right? So how do you find the hadith? So some people, they actually said, Allahu A'lam, they said what Ibn Hibban is trying to do is he's trying to do as Allah Ta'ala in the Quran, right? The Quran is, if you want to find a particular ayah, you either memorize the Quran or you read the whole Quran, right? Now we have search engines, but prior to that, right? How do you find an ayah, right? You can't say, oh, this ayah is about al-riba, it must be in Surah Al-Baqarah. No, you would have to memorize Surah Al-Baqarah to find these ayat about al-riba. So they said, Ibn Hibban wanted the same thing, right? You either memorize this book or you read the whole book. Allahu A'lam, right? I don't think that, if you see what he's doing, right? You know, we already have books arranged on the Masanid of the Sahaba. We have books arranged by chapters, by orders. But this is also an intelligent way to order the book. All the hadiths where the Prophet ﷺ commanded something, and the different types of commands that he gave, all the ways that he prohibited something, and the different ways he prohibited something. Right? So this is also an intelligent way. However, some of the scholars, because of this, you know, we want to refer to Sunan Ibn Hibban, but this Sahih Ibn Hibban, but this is very difficult. So Ibn Balban, he came and he made Al-Ihsan fi Tartib Sahih Ibn Hibban, and he basically took all of the hadiths and he ordered them according to what we're familiar with, Kitab al-Tahara, Kitab al-Salah, right, so on and so forth. So this is usually, if you find Sahih Ibn Hibban nowadays, it's usually in that order that Ibn Balban did. Now, وبالسند المتقدم وبالسند المتقدم إلى الحافظ الحجة الحاكم أبي عبد الله في كتاب الإيمان وهو أوله قال أخبرنا أبو محمد عبد الله بن محمد بن إسحاق الخزاعي بمكة قال أخبرنا عبد الله بن أحمد بن أبي مسرة قال حدثنا عبد الله بن يزيد المقري قال حدثنا سعيد بن أبي أيوب قال حدثني ابن عجلان عن القعقاع بن حكيم عن أبي صالح عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أكمل المؤمنين إيمانا أحسنهم خلقا. So now he mentions the book of Al-Hakim, Abu Abdullah Al-Hakim. He doesn't mention the name of his book, but if anyone knows, what is the name of the Al-Hakim's book? Al-Mustadrak. Good. And what is the purpose of this book? Right? What is Al-Hakim trying to do in this book? Not just haven't been mentioned, but yeah, they meet the criteria and they haven't been mentioned. Like, so what he's saying is, all these hadiths, they're either to the standard of Imam al-Bukhari, to the standard of Imam Muslim, or both of them, but they're not found in those books. This is the claim, but there's actually very weak, and even some people say even fabricated hadiths in the Mustadrak of Al-Hakim. Now Imam Al-Hakim is an alim, muhaddith. You know, so there's a lot of discussion about how did this happen, right? So they say that he authored this book at the end of his life. This is what As-Sakhawi, one of the students of Ibn Hajar, he says, he authored this book at the end of his life. And then, as most people do, you author a book and then you edit it afterwards, right? So at the beginning, it's just kind of what we would call like a rough draft, right? And then you go over and try to make the final draft, but he passed away before making the final draft. So he says if you look at the first fifth of the book, it's much more authentic than the last 4/5 of the book, which kind of lends support to that opinion. That's what happened. Allah knows best. There's a long discussion about it, but okay. وبالسند المتقدم إلى أبي عبد الله محمد بن إسحاق بن خزيمة في صحيحه قال حدثنا عبد الوارث بن عبد الصمد بن عبد الوارث قال حدثنا أبي قال حدثني أبي قال حدثنا حسين المعلم عن عبد الله بن بريدة أن عبد الله المزني رضي الله عنه قال حدثه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى قبل المغرب ركعتين ثم قال صلوا قبل المغرب ركعتين ثم قال في الثالثة لمن شاء خشي أن يحسبها الناس سنة. Sahih ibn Khuzaymah, also a very beneficial book, but we only have the first quarter of it, up to the end of Kitab al-Hajj, but it's published and very beneficial. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحافظ أبي بكر الإسماعيلي في صحيحه قال أخبرنا الحسن بن سفيان قال حدثنا حبان بن موسى عن ابن المبارك قال أخبرنا يونس عن الزهري وأخبرنا جعفر بن محمد الفريابي قال حدثنا مزاحم بن سعيد قال أخبرنا عبد الله بن المبارك قال أخبرنا يونس وأخبرنا القاسم بن زكريا قال حدثنا أحمد بن منصور قال حدثنا علي بن الحسين قال حدثنا ابن المبارك عن يونس عن الزهري قال أخبرني عبيد الله بن عبد الله بن عتبة بن مسعود عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أجود البشر وأجود ما يكون في رمضان حين يلقاه جبرائيل وكان جبرائيل يلقاه في كل ليلة من رمضان فيدارسه القرآن قال كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أجود بالخير من الريح المرسلة. Al-Ismaili, this is a mustakhraj of Sahih al-Bukhari. He calls it Sahih al-Ismaili, but this is a mustakhraj of Sahih al-Bukhari. So, is it okay if we finish after Salah? I mean, I know there was a program, but we have like 2 hadiths left, and then just to give out the ijazas. Okay. Is it okay if we take just 10 more minutes, 10 more minutes to finish up then? Okay. Is it okay? Could we take 5 more minutes to just finish up the book then? And 5 minutes. وبالسند المتقدم إلى الإمام الحجة أبي بكر بن السني في كتاب عمل اليوم والليلة في باب حفظ اللسان واشتغال بذكر الله تعالى وهو أوله. قال حدثنا أبو خليفة قال أخبرنا مسدد قال أخبرنا حماد بن زيد عن أبي الصهباء عن سعيد بن جبير عن أبي سعيد الخدري أظنه رفعه قال إذا أصبح ابن آدم فإن الأعضاء تكفر اللسان تقول اتق الله فينا فإن استقمت استقمنا وإن اعوججت اعوججنا. قال حدثنا محمد بن عبيد الله بن الفضل قال حدثنا محمود بن خالد قال حدثنا الوليد بن مسلم عن ابن ثوبان عن أبيه عن مكحول عن جبير بن نفير عن مالك بن يخامر عن معاذ بن جبل رضي الله عنه قال آخر كلمة فارقت عليها رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قلت يا رسول الله أخبرني بأحب الأعمال إلى الله عز وجل قال أن تموت ولسانك رطب من ذكر الله عز وجل. This is a book of Ibn Sunni, is a book of dhikr and deeds of the day and night, and he's one of the main students of Imam al-Nasa'i. وبالسند المتقدم, this is the last hadith, إلى الحافظ الشيخ محمد بن سليمان لكتابه جمع الفوائد من جامع الأصول ومجمع الزوائد المشتمل على صحيح البخاري ومسلم والترمذي والنسائي وابن ماجه والموطأ ومسند الدارمي وأبي داود ومسند الإمام أحمد ومسند أبي يعلى الموصلي ومسند البزار ومعاجم الطبراني الثلاثة. وأول حديث فيه بعد الترجمة لكتاب الإيمان فضل الإيمان عن عبادة بن الصامت رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من شهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأن محمدا عبده ورسوله وأن عيسى عبد الله ورسوله وكلمته ألقاها إلى مريم وروح منه والجنة حق والنار حق وأدخله الله الجنة على ما كان من العمل. وفي رواية أدخله الله تعالى من أبواب الجنة 8 أيها شاء للشيخين وللترمذي من شهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمد رسول الله حرم الله عليه النار لكن تلقيته إجازة وسماعا من السيد عمر بن أحمد بن عقيل عن الشيخ عبد الله بن سالم البصري عن مؤلفه إلى أصحاب الأصول إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم والحمد لله أولا وآخرا ظاهرا وباطنا وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم. And that's the end of the book. And أنا أجيزكم جميعا إجازة خاصة في هذا الكتاب ولمن كان يسمع ولم يتكلم أثناء الدرس أجيزه إجازة عامة. Right? So I give إجازة خاصة to everybody here, right? In the book, what's in the book, and إجازة عامة to anyone who was listening the entire time and not talking in the middle of the dars. Right? If you're talking in the middle of the dars, you have إجازة just in this book, but you can't narrate all of the Bukhari, Muslim, etc. From me. But anyone who was listening the whole time, then إجازة عامة, you can narrate anything from me. Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khair. And after the salah, inshallah, we'll just pass out the ijazat. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Please forgive me for going over time slightly.
الله أكبر الله أكبر